Before maps carried names of kingdoms, before the first stone was carved into monuments, there were places that breathed with their own ancient heartbeat. Cities that rose not from human ambition alone, but from something deeper, older, written in the language of earth and star. Tonight we walk through ruins that time forgot to claim completely. These are not myths, these are memories, sleeping beneath sand and sea, waiting for gentle footsteps like yours. Let us begin. Slowly. You stand at the edge of what once was, feeling the weight of civilizations that vanished not through war or plague, but through a slow, deliberate erasure. The morning mist clings to broken columns like the breath of ghosts, and you understand immediately that this place chose its own forgetting. There is something profound about ruins that were never meant to endure in human memory. These cities, scattered across the hidden corners of our world, carry secrets too vast for ordinary understanding. They were built by peoples who knew that true immortality comes not from preservation, but from the elegant art of disappearance. Your footsteps echo against stones that have forgotten their own names. Each step disturbs dust that once danced in the light, streaming through windows where children laughed, where lovers whispered, where elders shared wisdom that we can no longer comprehend. But the silence here is not empty, it thrums with the residual energy of lives fully lived and purposefully released. The architecture speaks a language older than words. Doorways frame empty air that once held the bustle of daily life. Staircases climb toward nothing, yet somehow toward everything. Walls bear no inscriptions because the message was never meant to be written. It was meant to be felt, experienced, absorbed through the skin and bone of those who dared to seek what others were content to lose. You run your hand along a wall and feel the subtle warmth that stone should not possess. This warmth speaks of the intention that built these places, not the crude intention of conquest or commerce, but the refined intention of beings who understood that some truths can only be preserved through forgetting, some wisdom only transmitted through absence. The wind moves through broken archways with a sound like distant singing. It carries fragments of conversations held in languages that evolved beyond the need for words. These were people who communicated through the arrangement of light and shadow, through the precise angle of a fountain's spray, through the mathematical poetry of stairs that led the walker into altered states of consciousness. In the distance, you see the outline of what might have been a temple or might have been a home. In these places, such distinctions dissolved into irrelevance. Every building was sacred because every act was worship, every moment was ceremony, every breath was prayer. They built their cities as prayers made manifest in stone and space. As you walk deeper into this first forgotten place, you begin to understand why it chose to slip from human memory. Some truths are too pure to survive the weight of historical fact. Some beauty is too complete to endure the gaze of scholars and tourists. These cities understood that the most profound gift they could offer was their own gentle disappearance, leaving only traces that would speak directly to hearts prepared to listen. The silence deepens around you, but it is a full silence, pregnant with everything that was and everything that chose to become invisible. You are walking through humanity's most generous act of love, the willingness to let go completely, to trust that what matters most will find its way to those who need it, even across centuries of forgetting. The wind carries whispers of names that no tongue remembers how to speak. The desert stretches before you like a sea of golden time, each dune a wave frozen in its eternal dance with wind and sun. But beneath your feet, through sand that shifts like liquid light, you sense the presence of something vast and patient. Olshiksto, city of white stone and flowing water that sleeps in the deep places where memory turns to dream. You descend through a crack in the earth that appeared with yesterday's sandstorm, following steps carved by hands that knew the desert when it bloomed, like a garden. The walls around you grow cooler as you spiral downward, and soon you hear it, the impossible sound of running water in a place where rain is legend and rivers are stories told by traveling merchants. The city reveals itself slowly, respectfully, like a secret shared between old friends. Streets paved with stones that gleam like pearls stretch into the soft darkness, lit by an inner radiance that owes nothing to sun or flame. Buildings rise around you with the organic curves of seashells, their walls flowing into one another, like frozen music, creating spaces that feel both intimate and infinite. You walk through phantom streets where fountains still echo with the sound of vanished rivers. The water that flows here obeys laws older than physics. It runs upward along graceful channels carved into walls, pooling in basins that float in midair, sustained by the mathematics of longing and the architecture of dreams. Each drop carries, within it, the memory of the great river that once blessed this land, before the desert chose to sleep and dream of water instead of holding it. The people who built this place understood that water is not merely a resource but a language, the Earth's most eloquent expression of its own generosity. They carved their city to be a conversation with water in all its forms, the patient persistence of underground springs, the playful dance of rain on stone, the profound stillness of pools that mirror not just the sky, but the soul of whoever gazes into their depths. Gardens bloom in the shadows between buildings, their plants sustained by the dream water that flows through channels carved with such precision that each stream carries exactly the life force needed by the roots it touches. These are not plants that grow in ordinary soil. They are expressions of the same creative principle that built the city itself, living sculptures of green thought and chlorophyll meditation. In the central plaza, you discover the heart of this buried miracle, a fountain that rises like a liquid prayer toward the sand ceiling far above. Its waters sing as they fall, each note a word in the language that the desert speaks to itself in the deep hours before dawn. The sound forms patterns in the air that your eyes can almost see, geometric forms of pure meaning that explain why this place chose to hide beneath the dunes rather than struggle against the changing world above. The buildings around the plaza hold chambers filled with the tools of their creators' trade, not the crude implements of ordinary construction, but instruments for shaping reality itself. Bowls that hold captured moonlight, mirrors that reflect not images but intentions, stones carved with patterns that teach the sand itself to remember when it was seabed, when it was forest floor, when it was the dust of stars learning to dream of Earth. You realize that this city was not buried by time or disaster. It chose to descend to become the dream that the desert carries in its deepest sleep. Its people understood that some forms of beauty are too pure to survive on the surface, where wind and sun would eventually reduce even the most perfect stones to dust. By choosing the depths, they chose eternity. The water continues its impossible flow around you, carrying whispers in a dozen languages that were spoken when the Sahara was green, when great rivers carved the landscape into gardens, when the people of this white city walked beneath open skies and sang with voices that could call rain from cloudless horizons. As you prepare to leave this buried dream, you understand that you will carry its secret waters with you always. Not in your memory, which is fallible, but in the deeper places where your spirit keeps the gifts it has received from contact with the eternal. The desert above will feel different now, no longer empty but full of sleeping wonders, no longer barren but simply dreaming of the abundance it holds in trust. From desert sands we turn to waters that hold their own buried kingdoms. You descend through layers of ocean that grow darker and more profound with each fathom, leaving behind the world of surface waves and diving toward mysteries that rest on the seafloor like prayers carved in stone. The water around you holds the weight of centuries, and in its blue-green depths, shapes emerge that defy every understanding of what should exist in the deep places of the earth. Spires pierce the darkness like frozen lightning, their Gothic curves reaching upward through the water with an elegance that speaks of builders who understood that beauty is humanity's most essential offering to the divine. These are the drowned cathedrals, temples that rest on the ocean floor, not because they fell from grace, but because they chose to serve a deeper congregation, the vast community of sea creatures who have adopted these sacred spaces as their own. You swim through nave and transept where fish dart like living prayers between columns that tower into the watery darkness above. Schools of silver swimmers move in formations that mirror the ancient processionals once held here when these spaces knew air and incense instead of salt water and tidal rhythms. The fish seem to understand the sanctity of these places, their movements taking on the measured quality of ritual, the reverent pace of beings participating in worship that transcends species and time. The bells still ring through the currents with melodies older than human song, not with metal striking metal, but with the deep resonance that water coaxes from properly shaped stone, with the harmonic frequencies that occur when ocean currents move through chambers designed to transform moving water into living music. Each note carries for miles through the deep, calling to creatures you will never see, announcing services held in languages that predate human speech. Stained glass windows, impossibly intact, filter the faint light that penetrates to these depths, into patterns of blue and green and gold that dance across the cathedral floors like living mandalas. The glass was made not just to please human eyes, but to create environments where light and water could collaborate in the ongoing creation of beauty. Marine plants grow in patterns that mirror the window designs, as if the light itself has taught them the sacred geometries that govern both art and growth. You discover altars carved from single blocks of stone that seem to glow with their own inner light, surrounded by offerings that the sea has provided, shells arranged in precise spirals, coral growths that follow mathematical principles of perfection, pearls that form naturally in the sacred spaces and roll across altar surfaces with the slow rhythm of deep ocean tides. These offerings were not placed by human hands but given by the sea itself, nature's own recognition of the sanctity that these builders achieved. Inside chapels designed for private contemplation, you find spaces where the acoustics create perfect silence. Chambers where the constant voice of the ocean fades to nothing, leaving only the sound of your own heartbeat and the profound quiet that exists at the center of all true prayer. Here, the builders created meditation halls where the pressure of deep water combines with sacred architecture to induce states of consciousness that surface dwellers can rarely achieve. The construction itself speaks of impossible engineering. Stones, fitted so perfectly that ocean currents cannot disturb them, foundations that grow stronger under the immense pressure of deep water, buttresses that use the weight of the sea itself to maintain the structural integrity of these underwater sanctuaries. The builders understood forces that human engineering has forgotten, principles of construction that work with natural power rather than against it. You swim through cloisters where monks of the deep, if such beings ever existed, might have walked in contemplation, their movements creating currents that still influence the flow of water through these spaces centuries later. The very architecture seems designed to channel the ocean's energy into patterns of peace and reflection, creating environments where the boundary between meditation and swimming dissolves into a single, flowing practice. In the deepest parts of these drowned cathedrals, you discover libraries where books made of materials that water cannot destroy still rest on shelves carved directly from the living rock. These volumes speak of theologies that embraced the flood, philosophies that saw submersion not as destruction but as transformation, as the ultimate baptism that would purify both the texts and their readers through total immersion in the planet's most essential element. As you prepare to rise toward the distant surface, leaving these drowned cathedrals to their eternal service in the depths, you understand that you have witnessed something beyond architecture. You have seen faith made manifest in stone and water, devotion expressed through the willingness to let the sea itself become the ultimate congregation, the final and most perfect worshipper. As the ocean keeps its secrets, so too do the mountains hold cities in their stone embrace. You climb through air that grows thinner and more crystalline with each step, ascending paths that wind between peaks where clouds are born and eagles soar through valleys carved by time itself. Here, where the earth reaches toward heaven with stone fingers, you discover settlements that were never built upon the mountains but carved from within them, cities that exist in the secret chambers of the world's highest places. The entrance appears as nothing more than a shadow between two boulders, but as you slip through the narrow opening, you emerge into vastness that takes your breath away. Before you stretches a city hewn directly from living rock, its streets and buildings carved with such skill that the boundary between architecture and landscape has dissolved into something both sacred and eternal. These mountain dwellers understood that true harmony with the earth required becoming part of the earth itself. Rather than impose their structures upon the landscape, they invited the landscape to teach them its own forms of beauty. Chambers flow into one another with the organic curves of water-carved stone, following the natural grain of the rock, as if the mountain itself had dreamed these spaces into existence. Corridors wind through the heart of the peak, like the passages of some vast organism lit by crystals that capture and amplify the small amounts of sunlight that penetrate through carefully carved shafts. The light moves through these spaces with a life of its own, shifting throughout the day as the sun travels its arc across the sky outside, creating an ever-changing illumination that connects the deep interior of the mountain with the cosmic rhythms that govern all life. You walk through public squares carved from single chambers in the rock, their ceilings soaring into darkness that echoes with the voices of those who once gathered here for ceremonies that celebrated the marriage between human intention and geological time. The acoustics in these spaces transform ordinary conversation into something approaching song, as if the stone itself adds harmonies to human voice, creating music from the simple act of community. Houses are carved directly into the walls of larger chambers, their doorways framed by natural stone formations that were incorporated into the design rather than removed. Families lived within the embrace of the mountain itself, their daily lives unfolding in spaces where every wall told the story of the Earth's formation, where every room was both shelter and geology lesson, both home and temple to the creative forces that shape continents. The water systems in these mountain cities represent engineering that borders on the miraculous. Natural springs that emerge from deep within the earth are channeled through carved channels that follow the mountain's own internal logic, bringing fresh water to every level of the settlement through a system that works entirely through gravity, and the patient understanding of how water moves through stone over geological time scales. Gardens exist in chambers where light shafts create perfect growing conditions, where plants that typically require open sky have learned to thrive in the filtered illumination that penetrates the mountain's heart. These are not merely practical food sources, but living art installations where the gardeners collaborated with the mountain to create growing spaces that serve both body and spirit, both nutritional needs and aesthetic longings. You discover workshops where the mountain people practiced crafts that used the mountain itself as both tool and material. Smithies carved near veins of metal ore where the heat of the earth's core was channeled through stone to create forges that burned without fuel. Pottery wheels carved from single blocks of stone where the mountain's own minerals became the clay, where every vessel created was both functional object and piece of the mountain itself transformed into human utility. The deepest chambers hold the most sacred spaces, meditation halls carved at the precise heart of the mountain, where the pressure and silence create conditions for consciousness to expand beyond the normal boundaries of human experience. Here, in the absolute center of these stone giants, practitioners could feel their individual awareness merge with the vast, slow consciousness of the mountain itself, accessing forms of wisdom that only geological time can teach. In these sacred depths, you find evidence of ceremonies where the mountain people celebrated their complete integration with their stone environment. Altars carved from the living rock where offerings were made not to external deities but to the mountain itself, recognizing the peak as a living entity worthy of gratitude for the shelter and sanctuary it provided. The art in these spaces speaks of aesthetics that found beauty in the marriage of human creativity with natural form, sculptures that emerge from the stone as if they had always existed there, waiting only for the carver to reveal them. Murals that incorporate the natural patterns in the rock, where human pigment and geological formation collaborate to create images that could exist nowhere else in the world. As you prepare to leave these cities carved in mountain hearts, descending back toward the world of sky and separate objects, you carry with you the profound understanding that true architecture is not about imposing human will upon the landscape, but about discovering the hidden potential that already exists within the natural world, waiting for consciousness sensitive enough to recognize it and skill patient enough to reveal it. From heights that touch the sky, we descend to depths where Earth itself becomes the storyteller. You descend through passages that slope gently into the Earth's embrace, leaving behind the world of weather and seasons to enter realms where time moves differently, where entire civilizations chose the deep places not from fear of the surface world, but from reverence for the Earth's hidden wisdom. Here, in caverns that stretch for miles beneath your feet, you discover underground kingdoms that were never hidden. They were simply built in the places where the Earth keeps its most profound secrets. The chambers that open before you defy every assumption about what exists beneath the surface. These are not crude caves or simple tunnels, but vast halls with vaulted ceilings that disappear into darkness above, supported by columns of living stone that the underground architects incorporated into their designs with such skill that you cannot tell where natural formation ends and human artistry begins. The light that illuminates these spaces comes from stones that glow within a fire, not the harsh glare of torches or the flickering uncertainty of candles, but the steady, gentle radiance of minerals that learn to hold light the way crystals hold sound. These luminous stones are arranged throughout the underground cities with the precision of a master painter, creating pools of illumination that guide movement through the spaces while leaving areas of comfortable shadow for rest and contemplation. You walk through streets that follow the natural contours of the earth, winding between chambers that served every function of surface cities, but with an intimacy and interconnectedness that open-air settlements could never achieve. Here, the boundary between public and private space dissolved into something more organic, more flowing, creating communities where individual dwellings opened into shared spaces with the gentle logic of water finding its natural course. The people who chose these depths understood that the earth itself is a living entity, and they built their cities as conversations with the geological consciousness that shapes continents over millions of years. Their architecture works with the natural expansion and contraction of stone, with the slow movements of underground water, with the subtle breathing of the earth that surface dwellers never notice, but that those who live within the earth must understand to survive and thrive. Water moves through these underground kingdoms in channels carved with mathematical precision, following courses that utilize the Earth's own gradients to bring fresh springs from the deep places to every level of the settlements. The sound of moving water creates a constant, gentle music that flows through all the spaces, a liquid soundtrack that connects every chamber, every street, every dwelling in a symphony of underground rivers. The chambers dedicated to growing food represent agricultural innovations that work with the Earth's own fertility rather than fighting against the absence of sunlight. Gardens that use the heat rising from the Earth's core, growing spaces lit by arrangements of luminous stones that provide exactly the spectrum of light that different plants require. Underground orchards where fruit trees grow in soil enriched by centuries of fallen leaves from surface forests that send their root systems down to these depths. You discover workshops where the underground people practiced crafts that utilized materials available only in the deep places, metals that form only under great pressure, crystals that grow in the slow darkness of geological time, stones that can be shaped only by those who understand the patience required to work with materials that measure their formation in millennia rather than seasons. The deeper you venture into these underground kingdoms, the more you understand that their builders possessed forms of knowledge that surface civilizations never developed. They knew how to read the Earth's subtle communications, the slight vibrations that predict earthquakes days before they occur, the changes in underground water flow that signal surface weather patterns, the slow songs that stones sing to each other across vast distances. In the deepest chambers, you find evidence of ceremonies that celebrated the underground people's marriage with the earth itself. Ritual spaces carved at the intersection of major underground rivers, where the sound of flowing water from multiple directions creates acoustic conditions that induce altered states of consciousness. Altars positioned at points where the Earth's magnetic field creates subtle variations that sensitive individuals can feel as physical sensations of peace and connection. The art in these spaces speaks of aesthetics that found beauty in the marriage of human creativity with geological form, sculptures that incorporate natural crystal formations where human carving and natural growth create hybrid artworks that could exist nowhere but in these deep places, murals that use pigments derived from underground minerals, creating colors that have never been seen on the surface world, hues that exist only in the deep places where certain elements combine under pressure and time. Libraries in these underground kingdoms hold books carved directly into the walls, not because paper was unavailable, but because the underground people understood that some knowledge belongs permanently to the places where it was discovered. These wall books speak of philosophies that embrace the slow wisdom of stone, theologies that recognize the Earth itself as the ultimate temple, sciences that study the deep processes that create continents and ocean basins. As you prepare to ascend back toward the surface world, leaving these underground kingdoms to their eternal conversation with the Earth's deep wisdom, you understand that you have witnessed a form of civilization that achieved something unique in human history: complete integration with the planet's own consciousness, a way of living that made human community part of the Earth's own ongoing creation of beauty and meaning. What grows in darkness eventually seeks the light of distant stars. You journey to lands where winter never truly ends, where the Earth wears its white robes with the dignity of eternal patience, and where the aurora borealis writes messages across the sky in languages older than humans speak. Here, in the polar regions where ordinary life struggles to survive, you discover the outlines of structures emerging from melting ice, cities built by peoples whose builder's breath is still visible in the frozen air that preserves their legacy. This cold here is not empty, but full of stories held in crystal suspension, full of lives lived at the edge of possibility, full of the profound silence that exists only in places where the Earth approaches the absolute stillness of space itself. As you walk across snow that has never known complete melting, your footsteps echo with a sharpness that carries for miles, announcing your presence to sleeping giants that rest beneath the ice. These polar cities speak of warmth that came from within, not from any sun. The structures that emerge from the retreating ice reveal architectural principles based not on fighting the cold, but on embracing it, on understanding that true warmth comes from community, from shared purpose, from the inner fire that humans can kindle even in the world's most challenging environments. The buildings you see rising from the ice are designed to work with winter rather than against it, to use the properties of cold and snow as construction materials rather than obstacles to overcome. The walls of these Arctic settlements are built from blocks of ice cut with such precision that they fit together like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle, creating structures that grow stronger as the cold increases, that become more stable as winter deepens rather than weaker. But this is not ordinary ice. It carries within it the breath of its builders, exhaled into the freezing air with such intention that it became part of the building material itself, creating walls that hold not just cold, but the warmth of human purpose. You walk through streets that follow the natural flow of wind across the polar landscape, designed so that the constant Arctic breeze moves through the city in patterns that distribute warmth efficiently, that carry the sense of cooking and the sounds of human activity to every dwelling. These builders understood that in the polar regions, community is not a luxury, but a necessity, and they designed their cities to make isolation impossible, to ensure that no individual could be truly alone in the vast white silence of the Arctic world. The central buildings of these polar cities are marvels of thermal engineering that work without fuel, without fire, without any external source of heat. Instead, they utilize the Earth's own warmth rising from depths where the planet's core maintains temperatures that could melt steel. Channels carved deep into the permafrost bring this geothermal energy to the surface through systems so elegant that they seem to work by magic rather than engineering. Gardens exist in these Arctic cities, not despite the cold, but because of innovations that transform winter itself into a growing season. Greenhouse structures built from specially treated ice that focuses rather than blocks sunlight, creating growing spaces where the Arctic summer's endless daylight is concentrated and stored in ways that provide growing energy throughout the long polar night. Plants that have been bred not just to tolerate cold, but to require it, species that bloom only when temperatures drop below freezing, that bear fruit only when nourished by snow. You discover workshops where the Arctic people practiced crafts that utilized materials available only in the world's coldest places, ice that forms only under specific atmospheric conditions, snow that carries particular mineral content from its journey through Arctic air masses, stones that can be worked only when they reach the temperatures that exist at the poles. Their tools are carved from materials that exist nowhere else on Earth, implements that would lose their essential properties if brought to warmer climates. The deeper you venture into these Arctic cities, the more you understand that their builders possessed knowledge about cold that no other human civilization ever developed. They knew how to read the messages written in frost patterns, how to predict weather by observing the behavior of ice crystals, how to navigate across trackless snow by following subtle variations in the way wind shapes the surface of frozen landscapes. In the heart of these polar settlements, you find evidence of ceremonies that celebrated the Arctic people's marriage with winter itself. Ritual spaces carved from single blocks of ice, where the acoustics created by frozen surfaces transform human voice into something approaching the song that glaciers sing as they move across the landscape. Altars positioned to catch the first light of the aurora borealis, where the northern lights themselves became part of the worship experience. The art in these spaces speaks of aesthetics that found beauty in the infinite variations of white, in the subtle colors that exist within snow and ice when observed by eyes trained to see them. Sculptures carved from ice that never melts, preserved by some technique that maintains the frozen state even when exposed to warmth. Paintings created with pigments that appear only at certain temperatures, artworks that can be fully seen only in the cold, that fade when brought into warmth but return when the temperature drops again. Libraries in these Arctic cities hold books, written on materials that exist only in polar regions, pages made from specially prepared animal skins that become more durable as they grow colder, inks derived from Arctic plants that remain liquid at temperatures that would freeze ordinary writing materials. These books speak of philosophies that embrace the wisdom of winter, theologies that recognize the sacred nature of survival at the Earth's extremes, sciences that study the deep processes that create ice ages and polar landscapes. As you prepare to leave these Arctic cities, returning to lands where seasons change and warmth is possible, you understand that you have witnessed a form of human adaptation that borders on the miraculous, communities that not only survived but thrived in conditions that would defeat most forms of life, cities that found beauty and meaning in the Earth's most challenging environments, peoples who discovered that true warmth comes not from external comfort, but from the fires that human beings can kindle within themselves and share with one another. Where ice preserves, the jungle consumes, yet both hide their treasures with equal devotion. You push through morning mist that rises from the forest floor like the Earth's own breathing, following paths that exist more as agreements with the jungle than as imposed routes through its verdant maze. Vines part before you with the courtesy of natural intelligence, and butterflies guide your steps toward discoveries that wait in the green cathedral of the world's most abundant wilderness. Here, where life grows with such intensity that the very air thrums with growth, you find civilizations that chose to build upward rather than outward, their cities rising into the canopy like prayers made manifest in wood and leaf. The trees. Here are not merely trees, but the foundations of entire cities, their massive trunks serving as the cornerstones of settlements that spiral upward through the forest canopy, reaching toward light while maintaining their roots in the rich darkness of the jungle floor. These emerald cities exist at every level of the forest, from the shadowy understory where different rules of existence apply, to the bright crown of the canopy where the builder's bridges span between ancient trees like prayers connecting Earth to sky. You climb spiral staircases carved directly into the living trunks of trees, so vast that their heartwood could contain entire houses while still maintaining the tree's health and vitality. The builders of these canopy cities understood that true architecture in the forest requires partnership with the growing things, requires designs that enhance rather than diminish the forest's own creative processes. Every structure you encounter has been grown as much as built, shaped through decades of patient collaboration between human intention and plant intelligence. Bridges spanning between the great trees create thoroughfares through the air itself, pathways suspended among the branches that sway gently with the wind, making movement through these aerial cities an act of dance rather than mere transportation. These bridges are woven from vines that continue to grow even as they serve as walkways, their living surfaces sprouting flowers that bloom according to the seasons, creating aerial gardens that exist only in the spaces between trees. The houses in these canopy cities are marvels of organic architecture, their walls grown from specially trained branches that the builders guided into architectural forms while the trees were still young. Rooms exist within the hollow spaces of enormous trunks, their walls alive with the slow circulation of sap, their floors carpeted with moss that grows in patterns that seem random but follow the mathematical principles that govern all forest growth. You discover that entire neighborhoods exist at different levels of the forest, each adapted to the unique conditions that exist at its particular height above the ground. The understory settlements are built for the shadowy world, where filtered light creates conditions of perpetual twilight, where buildings blend so completely with their surroundings that you cannot tell where the city ends and the jungle begins. Higher up, in the bright realms of the canopy, structures are designed to work with the intense tropical sunlight, using leaves and branches to create cooling systems that work entirely through the forest's own natural processes. Water systems in these emerald cities follow the forest's own patterns of rainfall and collection, channeling the frequent tropical rains through networks of leaves and branches that guide water to every level of the settlements. Cisterns are grown rather than built, hollow chambers in tree trunks that the builders shaped over years of patient cultivation, creating water storage systems that are living parts of the trees themselves, that purify and oxygenate the water through the tree's own biological processes. Gardens in these aerial cities exist at every level, from the forest floor to the highest branches, each adapted to the light conditions and growing possibilities of its particular height. Crops are grown in hanging gardens suspended between branches, in pocket gardens nestled in the joints where great limbs meet trunks, in aerial orchards where fruits hang like jewels among the leaves. The forest provides not just the foundation for these cities, but their entire food system, managed through agricultural techniques that enhance the jungle's natural abundance rather than replacing it. The deeper you venture into these emerald cities, the more you understand that their builders developed forms of knowledge that could exist only in partnership with the forest itself. They knew how to read the messages that trees send to each other through their root networks, how to predict weather by observing the behavior of forest animals, how to navigate through the jungle by following the subtle patterns that exist in the way different plants choose to grow in different locations. You discover workshops where the canopy people practice crafts that utilize materials provided by the living forest, not through destruction, but through the same kind of pruning and harvesting that helps forests remain healthy. Tools carved from specially hardened woods that grow stronger with use, textiles woven from fibers that the trees produce as naturally as they produce leaves, medicines distilled from plants that offer their healing properties as part of the ongoing cooperation between human and forest communities. In the highest reaches of these aerial cities, you find evidence of ceremonies that celebrated the Canopy people's integration with the forest's own consciousness. Ritual spaces built in the crowns of the tallest trees where worshippers could touch the sky while their feet remained connected to earth through hundreds of feet of living wood. Altars grown from the branches themselves where offerings were, made not to external deities but to the forest as a living entity worthy of gratitude and reverence. The art in these spaces speaks of aesthetics that found beauty in the endless creativity of natural growth, in the infinite variations that exist. Within the color green, in the living sculptures that result when human design collaborates with the forest's own artistic impulses. Paintings created with pigments that the forest provides willingly, artworks that change with the seasons as the living materials that compose them continue to grow and transform. Libraries in these emerald cities hold books written on materials and that the forest provides, bark paper that improves with age, inks made from fruits and flowers that maintain their color for centuries, binding materials that continue to live even as they hold knowledge together. These books speak of philosophies that embrace the wisdom of growth, theologies that recognize the sacred nature of the relationship between human consciousness and the green intelligence of plant life, sciences that study the communication networks that connect all forest life into a single, vast, thinking organism. As you prepare to descend from these emerald cities, returning to the forest floor and eventually to lands where trees grow separately rather than as parts of a single living city, you understand that you have witnessed a form of human culture that achieved something unique: complete integration with the planet's most creative and abundant ecosystem, a way of living that made human community part of the forest's own ongoing creation of beauty, meaning, and life itself. From green cathedrals, we journey to places where water itself became the foundation. On lakes that mirror both sky and memory, you find yourself standing at the edge of waters so still they seem like liquid glass, reflecting not just the clouds above, but something deeper. The echoes of cities that once floated upon the water's surface like dreams made manifest in wood and reed. These are the floating memories, settlements that existed in perfect harmony with tides and seasons, leaving only ripples as their legacy, ripples that still disturb the surface when the wind blows just right and the light falls at the proper angle. The lake stretches before you with the serenity of a meditation pool, its surface broken only by the gentle movements of waterbirds who seem to remember something about this place that human memory has forgotten. But as you wade into the shallows, your feet encounter structures beneath the water, not ruins fallen from some catastrophe, but the carefully preserved foundations of a civilization that chose to live upon the water itself, that understood the profound wisdom of impermanence and built their entire culture around the acceptance of constant change. You discover remnants of platforms that once supported entire neighborhoods, their construction so elegant that they could rise and fall, with seasonal water levels without losing their structural integrity. These floating foundations were not built to fight the water's natural rhythms, but to dance with them, to become part of the lake's own breathing, expanding in the spring floods and contracting in the autumn dry seasons, always maintaining the delicate balance between human need and aquatic ecosystem. The people who created these floating cities understood that water teaches lessons that land cannot provide. They built their homes on platforms that swayed gently with every breeze, that rocked softly with the passage of fish below, that required their inhabitants to develop a different relationship with stability itself. Living on water meant living with constant motion, meant finding peace not in the stillness of solid foundations, but in the rhythmic movements that connect all water to the tides of distant oceans. You swim among the submerged gardens where aquatic plants still grow in patterns that reveal the agricultural wisdom of the floating people. These underwater farms were designed to purify the lake water while providing food, creating closed-loop systems where human waste became nutrients for plants that cleaned the water and provided sustenance in return. The floating cities were not parasites upon the lake, but partners in its ecological health, communities that enhanced rather than degraded the aquatic environment that supported them. Channels carved into the lake bottom guide your exploration toward the deeper mysteries of these floating settlements. Here, you discover the anchor points where the largest platforms were secured, not with crude chains that would fight the water's movement, but with flexible systems that allowed the cities to move in harmony with seasonal changes while maintaining their essential positions. These anchoring systems worked with underwater currents and thermal layers, using the lake's own energy to maintain the city's locations. The central platform areas, now resting on the lake bottom, reveal the sophistication of communities that existed entirely on water. Markets where goods were traded from boat to floating shop, where merchants arrived by canoe and customers swam from their homes to make purchases. Schools where children learned to read the water's moods as easily as they learned to read written. Words where education included the arts of boat building, water navigation, and the subtle sciences of aquatic agriculture. You find evidence of workshops where the floating people created tools and art objects specifically designed for life on water. Furniture that could float if accidentally dropped overboard, cooking implements that worked with the gentle rocking motion of water-based homes, musical instruments that incorporated the sounds of lapping waves and moving water into their compositions. Every object created by these water people carried within it an understanding that life on the lake required a fundamentally different approach to design and utility. Religious spaces in these floating cities were designed around the spiritual significance of water itself. Temples that existed partially submerged, where worshippers could participate in ceremonies while standing waist-deep in the sacred lake, where the boundary between congregation and blessed water dissolved into a single act of aquatic devotion. Altars that floated freely, moved by currents that were interpreted as messages from the water spirits that guided the community's decisions. The seasonal rhythms of these floating cities followed patterns that land-based civilizations never understood. Communities that migrated with the water levels, following the lake's expansion and contraction throughout the year, maintaining different settlements for different seasons, always moving in harmony with the water's own cycles, rather than trying to impose human schedules upon aquatic time. As you explore deeper into these floating memories, you discover evidence of festivals that celebrated the community's marriage with water itself. Ceremonies held during the full moon when the lake's surface became a perfect mirror for celestial light. Rituals that involved the entire community swimming together through underwater passages that connected different sections of the floating city. Celebrations where the distinction between participant and water dissolved into joyous unity. The art that remains from these floating cities speaks of aesthetics that found beauty in reflection, in the constant interplay between surface and depth, between what appears solid and what reveals itself to be fluid. Sculptures designed to be viewed both from above and below the water's surface, creating different artistic experiences depending on whether the observer was standing on a platform or swimming beneath it. Paintings that used water-based pigments that would change color and intensity depending on humidity and water temperature. Artworks that were never static, but always responding to the aquatic environment that inspired their creation. Libraries in these floating cities held books written on materials that could survive periodic immersion, knowledge preserved in ways that worked with rather than against the water that defined their existence. These texts spoke of philosophies that embraced fluidity over fixity, theologies that recognized water as the most sacred of elements, sciences that studied the deep connections between all forms of life through the water that comprises the majority of every living cell. Water flows toward the sea, carrying with it the stories of islands that time forgot. You stand on shores where ancient maps mark lands that no longer exist, your feet touching beaches that remember islands now resting beneath waves that carry whispers of civilizations lost not to conquest or disaster, but to the simple, inexorable, rising of seas that claim back what the earth once offered as temporary gifts. These phantom islands hold the keys to understanding why some places choose to vanish rather than endure, why entire civilizations might embrace submersion as the ultimate expression of their philosophy. The coastline before you shifts with each tide, revealing and concealing clues about lands that existed here when the world was younger and the seas were lower. Rock formations emerge at low tide, their surfaces carved with symbols that speak of peoples who knew their time above water was limited, who built their entire culture around the acceptance of impermanence, who saw the approaching waves not as destruction but as transformation into a different kind of existence. Old maps spread before you show islands that cartographers drew with confident precision, complete with harbors and mountain peaks, settlements and rivers. But when you sail to these coordinates, you find only open ocean, only depths that hold secrets too profound for ordinary exploration. These were not errors in ancient navigation, but accurate records of places that existed in their own time. Islands that completed their terrestrial purposes and chose to continue their existence beneath the waves. You dive toward these submerged lands, following underwater ridges that once formed the spines of mountain ranges, swimming through valleys that once echoed with the voices of children at play, exploring the drowned topography of civilizations that built their cities, knowing they would eventually be claimed by the rising seas. The water here carries a different quality, a sense of stories still being told, of cultures that found ways to continue their essential work even after their transition from air to water. The ruins you discover on these submerged islands speak of architectural principles designed for transformation rather than permanence. Buildings constructed with materials that would become more beautiful underwater than they ever were in air, structures that were designed to serve different purposes once they were submerged, creating artificial reefs that would support marine life for centuries after their builders moved on to different forms of existence. You swim through streets that were planned with submersion in mind, their layouts creating current patterns that would distribute nutrients and oxygen throughout the submerged city, ensuring that the urban environment would enhance rather than disrupt the oceanic ecosystem that would eventually claim it. These island builders understood that true sustainability means designing for the full life cycle of a civilization, including its transformation into something beyond human habitation. The central plazas of these phantom islands reveal themselves as coral gardens, now their original stone surfaces providing foundations for marine growth that follows the aesthetic principles established by the original builders. The coral that grows here forms patterns that mirror the architectural decorations that once adorned these spaces when they knew sunlight and air, as if the marine life itself was trained to carry forward the artistic vision of the vanished islanders. You discover harbors that were designed to function both above and below water, with docking systems that could accommodate boats when the island was above sea level and submarine vessels after submersion. These harbors speak of island peoples who maintained trade relationships throughout their transition from terrestrial to aquatic existence, who saw the rising waters not as an ending, but as an evolution into a different kind of commerce, a different kind of community interaction The agricultural terraces on these submerged islands have become kelp forests now, their carefully engineered slopes providing perfect growing conditions for marine plants that serve the same ecological functions that the original crops provided for the island communities. The transition from land-based agriculture to aquatic farming appears to have been planned and managed, a conscious evolution from one form of food production to another. Temples on these phantom islands were built with dual purposes designed to serve their congregations, whether those congregations breathed air or water. Sacred spaces that could accommodate worship both above and below the waterline, with acoustic properties that worked with both airborne sound and underwater vibration, creating environments where spiritual practice could continue uninterrupted by the transition from terrestrial to aquatic existence. The libraries of these vanished islands held their knowledge in forms that water could not destroy, but could transform. Books written with inks that would dissolve in salt water but stain the surrounding stone with permanent records, ensuring that knowledge would become part of the landscape itself. Scrolls designed to release their information slowly into the surrounding water, creating environments where fish and marine plants would carry fragments of ancient wisdom throughout the oceanic ecosystem. You find evidence of ceremonies that celebrated the island communities approaching submersion, rituals that welcomed the rising seas as old friends returning after a long absence. These were not desperate acts of a doomed civilization, but joyous celebrations of transformation, festivals that honored the island's transition from one form of beauty to another, from terrestrial gardens to oceanic sanctuaries. The art that remains from these phantom islands speaks of aesthetics that found equal beauty in emergence and submersion, in the moment when land meets water, and both are transformed by the encounter. Sculptures that were designed to look complete only when viewed through moving water, paintings that used pigments which would change color as they absorbed moisture from the rising seas, creating artworks that documented their own transformation from air-based to water-based existence. As you prepare to surface from these explorations of islands that never were, you understand that you have witnessed something beyond the simple rise and fall of civilizations. You have seen communities that achieved such harmony with natural processes that they could embrace their own dissolution as an act of artistic completion, cultures that understood that true immortality comes not from resisting change, but from designing transformation so elegantly that the change itself becomes a form of beauty that enriches the world long after the original form has disappeared. Between what was and what might have been lie the cities built from pure intention. In valleys where minerals grow like flowers, you discover cities constructed entirely from living crystal, their walls humming with frequencies that speak directly to the soul rather than the ear. These crystal sanctuaries rise from the earth like geological prayers, their translucent spires catching and transforming light into colors that exist nowhere else in the natural world, creating environments where the boundary between solid matter and pure energy dissolves into something that can only be called sacred architecture. The approach to these crystal cities requires a different kind of navigation, one that depends not on maps or landmarks, but on the ability to hear the songs that different minerals sing to each other across vast distances. Each type of crystal resonates at its own frequency, and the builders of these sanctuaries understood how to arrange different minerals in patterns that would create harmonious symphonies of stone, cities that were essentially musical compositions, played out in architectural form. You walk through gates carved from single crystals so large that they dwarf the greatest cathedrals ever built by human hands, their surfaces faceted with mathematical precision that creates optical effects impossible to achieve with ordinary stone. These crystal gates focus and refract both light and sound, creating entry experiences that prepare visitors for the altered states of consciousness that naturally occur within environments built entirely from living mineral formations. The streets of these crystal sanctuaries are paved with gems that were not mined but grown, cultivated over centuries by builders who understood that true crystal cities could not be carved from existing formations but must be coaxed into existence through patient collaboration with the Earth's own crystalline intelligence. Walking on these gem-paved streets creates subtle vibrations that travel through the crystalline structures around you, making your every step part of the city's ongoing musical composition. Buildings in these crystal sanctuaries grow rather than decay, their mineral components continuing to develop new formations and configurations throughout the centuries, making these cities living entities that evolve continuously while maintaining their essential architectural harmony. The crystal builders designed their cities to improve with age, to become more beautiful and more functional as time passes, and the mineral structures mature into increasingly complex and sophisticated arrangements. You discover that the crystal people developed forms of construction that worked with the natural tendency of different minerals to grow in specific patterns, creating architecture that channeled and amplified the Earth's own creative processes. Rather than imposing human design upon mineral materials, they learned to recognize the inherent architectural potential within different crystal formations and provided the conditions needed for that potential to manifest as functional living spaces. The light within these crystal cities behaves according to laws that seem to transcend ordinary physics, traveling through the translucent walls and floors in patterns that create illumination systems requiring no external energy source. The crystals themselves capture, store, and distribute light with an efficiency that makes every surface, both window and lamp, creating environments where darkness never exists, but neither does harsh brightness, only gentle luminosity that adjusts automatically to human needs and activities. Water systems in crystal cities work through the natural piezoelectric properties of certain minerals, using the pressure created by flowing water to generate electrical fields that power other crystalline systems throughout the city. This creates closed-loop energy cycles where every system supports every other system, where the movement of water through crystal channels provides power for lighting, heating, and the various mineral growing processes that maintain the city's ongoing development. You find workshops where the crystal people practiced crafts that existed nowhere else in human history, creating tools and art objects from living mineral formations that would continue to grow and develop after their completion. Crystals carved into bowl shapes that would slowly grow handles over decades of use, gem formations shaped into jewelry that would change color and pattern to match the emotional states of their wearers, mineral sculptures that would develop new features and configurations in response to the aesthetic preferences of those who lived with them. The acoustic properties of these crystal cities create environments where sound becomes a tangible presence, where spoken words generate visible light patterns in the air, where music played on crystal instruments creates geometric forms that hang in space like solid objects. The crystal builders understood that in cities made from resonant minerals, every sound becomes architecture, every voice becomes a contribution to the ongoing construction of beauty and meaning. Religious spaces in these crystal sanctuaries were designed around the spiritual properties of different minerals, creating environments where the natural electromagnetic fields generated by various crystals would induce specific states of consciousness in worshippers. Meditation chambers carved from amethyst for practices requiring deep inner vision, prayer halls built from rose quartz for ceremonies celebrating love and connection, temples constructed from clear quartz for rituals focused on clarity and spiritual purification. The deeper you venture into these crystal sanctuaries, the more you understand that their builders developed forms of knowledge that could exist only in partnership with mineral intelligence itself. They learn to read the information stored within crystal matrices to understand the deep time histories that minerals carry within their atomic structures, to communicate with forms of consciousness that exist at geological rather than biological time scales. You discover libraries where knowledge was stored not in books but in the crystalline matrices themselves, information encoded at the molecular level within specific mineral formations. These crystal libraries hold vast amounts of data that can be accessed by those who understand how to read the frequency patterns that different crystals emit, creating repositories of wisdom that grow more comprehensive as the crystals themselves continue to develop new structures and configurations. The art in these crystal cities speaks of aesthetics that transcend the visual, creating beauty that can be experienced through multiple senses simultaneously. Sculptural works that generate their own music through the interaction of different mineral frequencies, architectural decorations that create specific scents through the subtle chemical interactions between various crystal formations, artistic installations that influence the emotional atmosphere of their surroundings through carefully arranged electromagnetic fields. As you prepare to leave these crystal sanctuaries, returning to a world where stone is dead and buildings deteriorate rather than grow, you understand that you have witnessed a form of human partnership with the mineral kingdom that achieved something unprecedented in terrestrial history. These crystal builders created cities that were literally alive, urban environments that participated actively in their own ongoing creation, communities where the boundary between inhabitants and habitat dissolved into a continuous collaboration between human consciousness and mineral intelligence. From crystal songs, we turn to places where silence itself became architecture. You enter realms where dawn and dusk merged into eternal golden hour, where civilizations built their entire existence around the gentle transition between light and shadow, day and dream. These cities of perpetual twilight exist in the liminal spaces where time moves differently, where the harsh boundaries between day and night dissolved into something more subtle, more nuanced, more conducive to the kinds of consciousness that flourish in the soft spaces between extremes. The light here falls with the quality of late afternoon in autumn, that golden radiance that makes every surface glow within a warmth that transforms ordinary objects into items of beauty and contemplation. But this is not the light of any particular sun or season. It is light that has been cultivated, refined, and maintained through architectural principles that work with atmospheric conditions to create permanent states of luminous transition, environments where the eye never needs to adjust because the illumination never changes. You walk through streets designed around the aesthetic and practical requirements of eternal twilight, where buildings are positioned to catch and hold the golden light, to reflect it from surface to surface in patterns that maintain the gentle radiance throughout every space and season. The Twilight builders understood that this particular quality of light creates psychological and spiritual conditions that support forms of human activity impossible under the harsh brightness of noon or the complete darkness of midnight. The architecture of these twilight cities reflects a profound understanding of how different qualities of light affect human consciousness and social interaction. Buildings with walls that seem to glow from within, their surfaces treated with techniques that capture and slowly release the golden twilight radiance, creating environments where the distinction between interior and exterior lighting disappears into a seamless continuity of gentle illumination that supports both private contemplation and community gathering. You discover that the people of these twilight cities developed daily rhythms that followed the subtle variations within their eternal golden hour, recognizing dozens of different qualities of twilight that others would see as identical. Their culture was built around sensitivity to the minute changes in light quality that occur within what appears to be unchanging illumination, creating social and spiritual practices that worked with nuances of radiance invisible to those accustomed to the crude alternations of day and night. Gardens in these twilight cities grow plants that evolved specifically for conditions of eternal golden light, species that exist nowhere else in the world because they require the particular spectrum and intensity that exists only in these perpetual transition zones. These gardens bloom continuously, their flowers maintaining perfect beauty indefinitely under the unchanging care of light that never becomes too bright or too dim to support their delicate requirements. The water features in twilight cities are designed to work with the golden light in ways that create constantly shifting patterns of reflection and refraction, fountains and pools that transform the eternal radiance into moving displays of liquid light that provide visual variety within the overall consistency of twilight illumination. Water here becomes a medium for light sculpture, creating three-dimensional compositions of radiance that change continuously while maintaining perfect harmony with the surrounding golden atmosphere. You find workshops where the twilight people created art and tools specifically designed for their unique lighting conditions, developing techniques for working with materials that reveal their true colors and textures only under the gentle radiance of eternal golden hour. Craftspeople who understood that different qualities of light bring out different properties in wood, stone, metal, and fabric, creating objects of beauty that could exist in their full perfection only within the twilight cities themselves. Religious spaces in these twilight cities were designed around the spiritual significance of transition itself, creating environments where worshippers could experience the sacred nature of boundaries dissolved, of states of being that exist between traditional categories. Temples where the eternal twilight creates conditions of consciousness that transcend the ordinary alternations of sleeping and waking. Sacred spaces where meditation naturally deepens into states that combine the clarity of day with the receptivity of night. The social structures of twilight cities reflect communities that organize their entire civilization around principles of balance and gentle transition rather than the dramatic contrasts and sharp boundaries that characterize most human societies. Governance systems based on consensus and gradual change rather than conflict and sudden shifts, economic arrangements that emphasize continuity and sustainability rather than growth and competition, cultural practices that celebrated the beauty of subtle variation within overall harmony. You discover libraries where the eternal twilight creates perfect reading conditions, where the golden light never strains the eyes or creates harsh shadows on the page, where scholars could study for hours without the fatigue that comes from adapting to changing illumination. These libraries hold books that were written specifically for twilight reading, texts that explore the philosophical and spiritual implications of living in eternal transition, knowledge that could be fully comprehended only by minds accustomed to the particular states of consciousness that perpetual golden hour creates. The art in these twilight cities speaks of aesthetics that found infinite beauty within subtle variation, creating works that reveal new details and meanings under the unchanging yet somehow ever-changing quality of eternal golden light. Paintings that seem to shift and move as the observer's attention changes, sculptures that appear different from every angle, not because of their physical structure, but because of how the twilight illumination interacts with the consciousness of the viewer. Artistic installations that create beauty through the patient exploration of nuance rather than the dramatic impact of contrast. Music in the twilight cities follows principles of gentle modulation and subtle harmony rather than dramatic crescendo and sharp transitions, creating compositions that mirror the eternal golden hour in sound, pieces that seem to continue indefinitely while maintaining perfect interest and beauty throughout their endless development. musical instruments designed to produce tones that complement the twilight atmosphere, creating sounds that seem to emerge from the golden light itself rather than from physical vibration. As you prepare to leave these cities of perpetual twilight, returning to a world where light and darkness alternate with mechanical precision, you understand that you have experienced a form of human culture that achieved something extraordinary in its subtle perfection. These twilight builders created environments that supported the development of consciousness itself, communities where the harsh extremes that usually dominate human experience were replaced by conditions of eternal balance that allowed both individual souls and collective culture to explore the infinite possibilities that exist in the gentle spaces between opposites. In Twilight's embrace, we find the bridges that connect visible and invisible worlds. Walking through ruins where the builder's intentions still shape the air itself, you encounter the lingering presence of master craftsmen whose vision transcended physical materials and entered the realm of pure creation. These are the architect ghosts, the invisible masters whose creative essence continues to influence the spaces they designed centuries after their physical forms returned to dust, whose buildings remain alive with purpose and meaning long after their builders departed for other forms of existence. The stones here carry more than structural weight. They hold the concentrated intentions of their builders, the dreams and visions that guided every decision about placement, proportion, and purpose. You can feel these intentions as a tangible presence in the air around you, a gentle pressure that guides your movements through spaces designed not just for physical functionality, but for the cultivation of specific states of mind and spirit, architecture that continues its work of transformation even in the absence of its creators. You walk through doorways that were positioned with such precision that passing through them automatically shifts your consciousness into contemplative states, halls where the proportions between height, width, and length create acoustic conditions that naturally induce feelings of peace and reverence. Rooms where the angle of walls and the quality of light work together to support whatever activity was originally intended to take place there, whether prayer, study, artistic creation, or community gathering. The building techniques visible in these ghost-touched ruins speak of construction methods that worked with invisible forces as much as with physical materials, architecture that took into account not just load-bearing requirements and weather resistance, but also the subtle energies that flow through landscapes, the electromagnetic fields that influence human health and consciousness, the geometric principles that connect earthly structures with cosmic patterns and celestial rhythms. You discover that these architect ghosts possessed knowledge about the relationship between built environments and human consciousness that has been almost entirely lost to contemporary understanding. They knew how specific combinations of materials would affect the emotional atmosphere of a space, how certain proportions would influence the quality of thought that occurred within their buildings, how the orientation of structures relative to cardinal directions and seasonal sun angles would support or hinder the activities intended to take place within them. Evidence of their continuing presence appears in the way these ruins maintain themselves, the mysterious processes by which stones stay properly positioned despite centuries of weather and earthquake, the way vegetation grows in patterns that seem to respect and enhance the original architectural intentions rather than destroying them through random natural processes. It is as if the architect ghosts continue to tend their creations, maintaining the essential integrity of their designs through means that transcend physical intervention. You find tools left behind in these ghostly workshops, implements that reveal construction techniques based on principles that contemporary engineering has forgotten, measuring devices that worked with proportional relationships rather than fixed units, levels that responded to energy fields rather than simply gravitational orientation, chisels and carving implements designed to work with the natural grain and intention of stone rather than forcing materials into predetermined shapes through brute application of force. The workshops themselves demonstrate building methods that treated construction as a form of collaboration between human intention and material intelligence, where the builders learn to recognize the inherent potential within different stones, woods, and metals, then provided the conditions needed for those materials to express their natural tendency toward beauty and functionality. These architect ghosts understood that true building meant coaxing the best qualities out of materials rather than imposing human will upon reluctant substances. Religious spaces touched by these architect ghosts reveal design principles that treated sacred architecture as a technology for facilitating communication between human consciousness and divine intelligence, creating environments where the physical structure itself served as a medium for spiritual experience. Temples where every architectural element, from the curvature of arches to the texture of floor surfaces, was designed to support specific forms of religious practice and mystical experience. You discover evidence of community spaces where the architect ghosts applied their understanding of how built environments influence social interaction, creating gathering places that naturally encouraged cooperation, dialogue, and mutual support rather than competition or conflict. Public squares where the proportions and sight lines subtly influenced crowd behavior toward harmony rather than agitation. Marketplaces where the flow of movement and the acoustic properties encouraged honest commerce and fair dealing. The residential areas designed by these ghostly masters revealed domestic architecture that supported the full development of human potential within family and individual life. Homes where the arrangement of rooms and the quality of light and air promoted both privacy and healthy social interaction, where the relationship between indoor and outdoor spaces encouraged connection with natural rhythms and seasonal changes while providing security and comfort. Libraries and study spaces touched by architect ghosts demonstrate their understanding of how built environments can enhance learning and intellectual development, creating rooms where the acoustics, lighting, and proportions naturally support concentration and contemplation, where the arrangement of shelves and reading areas encourages both focused individual study and productive scholarly collaboration, where the architecture itself seems to participate in the preservation and transmission of knowledge. The art integrated into these ghost-touched buildings reveals aesthetic principles that treated architectural decoration not as mere ornament, but as functional elements that influenced the consciousness of those who lived and worked within these spaces. Carvings, paintings, and sculptural elements that served as meditation focal points, as teaching tools, as reminders of spiritual principles and natural laws, as environmental modifications that enhance the psychological and spiritual effects of the architectural spaces they adorned. As you prepare to leave these ruins where architect ghosts continue their invisible work, you understand that you have encountered something beyond ordinary construction techniques or historical preservation. You have experienced buildings that remain alive with their creators' intentions, spaces where human consciousness successfully collaborated with material reality to create environments that continue to serve their original purposes long after. Their builders moved beyond the need for physical form, architecture that demonstrates the possibility of creating works that outlast not just their creators' lives, but their creators' physical existence itself. What master builders began, the earth itself continues to complete. You wander through places where the distinction between urban planning and natural growth dissolved completely, creating settlements that bloomed like flowers and changed with the seasons. These are the gardens that became cities, communities, where human habitation and plant life evolved together into integrated ecosystems that served both human needs and botanical intelligence. Urban environments that grew rather than being built, that changed continuously while maintaining their essential character and function. The pathways here follow the natural logic of root systems and stem growth rather than the geometric precision of conventional city planning, creating transportation networks that curve and branch with organic intelligence that adapt to seasonal changes and natural obstacles with the flexibility of living systems. Walking through these garden cities feels like moving through the circulatory system of some vast organism, following routes that seem to anticipate your needs while guiding you toward discoveries that appear spontaneous but reveal themselves to have been planned with sophisticated understanding of how humans and plants can collaborate in the creation of beautiful, functional spaces. You discover neighborhoods that exist within the embrace of enormous trees, residential areas where homes were grown rather than built, their walls formed by training branch and vine into architectural configurations that provide shelter while maintaining their living connection to root and soil. These tree houses exist as partnerships between human need and plant intelligence, dwellings that improve with age as their living walls grow stronger and more weather-resistant, homes that change color with the seasons and adjust their internal climate through the natural processes of photosynthesis and transpiration. The central areas of these garden cities reveal public spaces that function as both community gathering places and botanical gardens, plazas where flowering trees provide natural overhead canopy, while their root systems create raised seating areas that serve human social needs while supporting plant health. Fountains that work as irrigation systems for surrounding gardens, markets where vendors sell produce grown in the same spaces where customers shop, creating local food systems with zero transportation costs and maximum freshness and nutritional value. Water systems in these garden cities follow the natural patterns of plant-based water management, utilizing the transpiration and root absorption of carefully selected tree and shrub species to create urban water cycles that purify, distribute, and conserve water through entirely biological processes. Rain gardens that capture and slowly release stormwater while creating beautiful wetland environments within the urban landscape. Living irrigation networks that deliver water to every plant and human dwelling through channels lined with aquatic plants that clean and oxygenate the water as it flows. You find workshops where the garden city inhabitants practiced forms of agriculture that existed nowhere else in human experience, growing techniques that integrated food production with housing, with transportation systems, with waste management, with energy production, creating closed-loop urban ecosystems where every human activity supported the health and productivity of the plant communities that provided the infrastructure for urban life. Gardens that were simultaneously art installations, food production systems, air purification networks, and architectural elements. The seasonal rhythms of these garden cities created urban experiences that changed dramatically throughout the year, communities where the architecture itself participated in the celebration of natural cycles through flowers that bloomed in sequence to provide continuous beauty from spring through fall, through fruit and nut trees that provided different foods throughout the growing season, through deciduous and evergreen plants arranged to create optimal lighting and climate conditions for both summer and winter. Educational systems in garden cities were based on direct interaction with the living systems that supported urban life. Schools where children learned mathematics by measuring plant growth rates, where they studied chemistry through soil composition and photosynthesis, where they developed social skills by participating in the cooperative labor required to maintain the integrated plant-human communities. Learning that took place entirely within the living environment that provided context and practical application for every subject. You discover religious and ceremonial spaces where the garden city inhabitants celebrated the sacred partnership between human consciousness and plant intelligence. Temples that existed within groves of specially cultivated sacred trees, outdoor sanctuaries where worship services followed the seasonal cycles of flowering and harvest, meditation spaces designed around the contemplation of growth processes, and natural beauty as expressions of divine creative activity. The governance systems of garden cities were based on ecological principles rather than political theories, decision-making processes that took into account the needs and cycles of the plant communities that provided urban infrastructure, community leadership that rotated seasonally to reflect the changing requirements of different phases in the agricultural and horticultural cycles that governed city life, laws and social customs that prioritized the health of the integrated human-plant ecosystem over individual profit or convenience. Art in the garden cities was created through collaboration between human creativity and natural growth processes, living sculptures where artists guided plant growth into aesthetic configurations that changed and developed over years and decades, paintings created with pigments derived from locally grown plants and applied to surfaces that would weather and change as part of the artistic experience, musical compositions that incorporated the sounds of wind through leaves, water through root systems, and insects among flowers as essential elements. Libraries in garden cities held their knowledge, in living form as well as in traditional books. Botanical collections where different plant species served as repositories for specific types of information about agriculture, medicine, climate, and ecology. Knowledge systems where learning required direct interaction with the living sources of wisdom rather than abstract study of written materials. Educational approaches that made every garden simultaneously a classroom and a reference work. The economic systems of garden cities were based on the productivity and abundance that resulted from optimal integration of human activity with natural systems, communities where the collaborative relationship between inhabitants and plant life produced surpluses of food, medicine, building materials, and other necessities without the extraction and exploitation that characterized other forms of economic organization. Urban environments where wealth was measured in terms of ecosystem health and community well-being rather than individual accumulation. As you prepare to leave these gardens that became cities, returning to urban environments where plants exist, as decorations rather than partners, you understand that you have witnessed a form of human settlement that achieved something unprecedented in the history of civilization. These garden builders created communities that enhanced rather than degraded the natural environments they inhabited, urban systems that demonstrated the possibility of human culture that exists in true partnership with the living intelligence of the plant kingdom, cities that proved that human creativity and natural beauty can collaborate in the creation of environments that serve both human aspirations and ecological health. From organic growth, we turn to places built according to patterns written in the stars. High on plateaus where the sky feels close enough to touch, you discover settlements arranged to mirror star patterns, their inhabitants living in conscious harmony with celestial rhythms and cosmic time. You climb ancient pathways carved into cliffsides, each step bringing you closer to places where Earth meets heaven. The air grows thin here, crystalline and sharp, carrying whispers of wind across stone terraces that have watched the stars wheel overhead for countless centuries. As you reach the plateau's edge, your breath catches not from the altitude, but from recognition. Before you spreads a city laid out like a map of the heavens themselves. Streets curve in perfect spirals, mimicking the arms of distant galaxies. Buildings cluster in patterns that mirror constellations, their windows positioned to frame specific stars at precise moments throughout the year. This is not coincidence. This is cosmic architecture, built by people who understood that human settlement should dance in harmony with celestial movement. Walk slowly through these star-mapped streets. Notice how the pathways align with astronomical events, how certain Doorways frame the rising of specific constellations, how plazas are positioned to capture the light of planets at their brightest moments. The builders of this place were not merely constructing homes and temples, they were creating instruments of cosmic connection, tools for living in conscious relationship with the universe's grand design. In the central plaza stands a structure, unlike any earthly building. Its walls are honeycombed with precisely calculated openings, each one angled to receive starlight at different seasons. During certain celestial alignments, the entire building would have glowed like a lantern, filled with silver threads of cosmic illumination. Stand here at twilight, and you can almost see how it must have appeared, transformed into a beacon connecting earth and sky. The houses surrounding this stellar temple were built according to astronomical principles. Each dwelling was oriented to face a particular star or planet, its windows and doors timed to welcome specific celestial events. Families would have awakened to the rising of their guardian constellation, planned their days according to planetary movements, celebrated festivals timed to cosmic rhythms that modern life has forgotten how to feel. Evidence suggests the inhabitants tracked not just the obvious celestial cycles, but subtle patterns invisible to casual observation. They noted the precession of equinoxes, the complex dance of planetary conjunctions, the slow wheel of deep sky phenomena that repeat across centuries. Their city was a three-dimensional calendar, a lived-in observatory where daily life moved, in harmony with cosmic time. Look closer at the construction methods. The stones were quarried and placed according to astronomical calculations. Certain walls were built to cast shadows that would mark significant celestial events. Channels carved into floors would fill with rainwater in patterns that reflected star positions overhead. Even the gardens were planted to bloom in sequences that honored the passage of constellations across night skies. These were not primitive people, superstitious about heavenly lights. They were sophisticated astronomers who understood that human beings are part of the cosmic story, that our rhythms and cycles are connected to universal patterns larger than individual lives. Their city expressed a philosophy that saw no separation between terrestrial and celestial existence. In one quarter of the settlement, you find evidence of what can only be called stellar worship. Not worship of stars as gods, but reverence for the cosmic order they represent. Circular chambers with domed ceilings marked with star maps served as meditation spaces where people could contemplate their place in the infinite. These rooms were designed with acoustic properties that would amplify whispered prayers and send them rising toward the heavens. The technology they developed was elegantly simple yet profoundly sophisticated. Stone discs with carefully positioned holes functioned as star computers, calculating celestial positions decades in advance. Water-filled bowls served as reflecting telescopes, allowing precise observation of stellar movement. Vertical pillars cast shadows that marked not just daily time, but seasonal shifts and astronomical events separated by years. As you explore deeper into this elevated city, you begin to understand that its abandonment might not have been tragic. Perhaps the inhabitants achieved what they sought, such perfect attunement to cosmic rhythms that they transcended the need for physical settlement. The empty buildings remain as teaching tools, star maps written in stone, for future wanderers who might rediscover the connection between human consciousness and celestial consciousness. The wind here carries a different quality than in lower places. It seems to whisper with the voice of infinity, carrying messages between Earth and the star-scattered darkness above. Standing in these ruins at night, you feel the presence of those who once lived here, their awareness expanded beyond individual concerns to embrace cosmic perspective. This is where you learn that home can be more than shelter from weather and wilderness. Home can be conscious participation in universal harmony, daily life structured to honor the vast patterns of which human existence is but one beautiful thread. The Constellation Cities teach that we are not separate from the cosmos, but integral to its grand design. You walk through cities that were themselves vast libraries, where knowledge was stored not in books but in the arrangement of stones, the direction of pathways, the angles of walls that still teach their lessons to the patient observer. Here stands learning made manifest in architecture, wisdom encoded in the very streets you walk. Every stone placement was deliberate, every pathway a sentence in an enormous text written across the landscape. This is knowledge that cannot burn, cannot be destroyed by conquest or neglect, because it exists in the fundamental structure of the place itself. The entrance to this stone library is marked by pillars carved with spiraling patterns that seem to move as you watch them. These are not decorative flourishes, but mnemonic devices, visual triggers designed to activate specific types of memory and understanding. Ancient librarians knew that information stored in images and spatial relationships persists longer than words written on fragile materials. As you follow the main avenue, notice how it curves according to mathematical principles embedded in its design. The width varies at precise intervals, creating acoustic properties that would carry spoken words according to calculated patterns. Lectures delivered at specific points would be heard clearly in distant courtyards, while private conversations in other locations would remain contained by clever architectural acoustics. The buildings themselves function as three-dimensional texts. Room sizes follow proportional relationships that encode numerical knowledge. Doorway heights represent mathematical constants. The angles at which walls meet express geometric theorems that students would absorb simply by moving through the spaces daily. Architecture became pedagogy, and the city taught its lessons to every inhabitant. In what must have been the central archive, you find structures that defy immediate understanding, massive stone discs with intricate carvings that seem random, until you realize they represent star maps, genealogies, calendrical systems, and astronomical calculations all layered into single surfaces. These were not just records, but teaching instruments, requiring students to develop the visual literacy necessary to read information encoded in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The storage system they developed was ingenious in its simplicity and scope. Different types of knowledge were organized into separate quarters of the city. The astronomical district featured buildings oriented to track celestial movements, their walls carved with observational data accumulated over centuries. The mathematical quarter contained structures whose proportions demonstrated advanced theorems. The historical section preserved cultural memory in the form of relief carvings that told stories across entire building facades. But perhaps most remarkable was their system for preserving procedural knowledge, the understanding of how to do things rather than merely knowing facts about them. Workshops and laboratories were designed so that their physical layout would guide students through complex processes step by step. The arrangement of tools, the height of work surfaces, the positioning of equipment all followed patterns that would teach proper technique to anyone working in the space. Water played a crucial role in this stone library's function. Channels carved into floors would fill during rains, creating temporary pathways that connected different sections of knowledge. According to seasonal patterns, students would follow these water roads to discover relationships between different fields of study, letting natural flow guide their educational journeys. The acoustics of this place reveal another layer of its educational design. Certain courtyards amplify whispered words into clear speech, while others dampen sound to create spaces for quiet contemplation. Some chambers produce harmonic resonances when people speak together, encouraging collaborative learning. The builders understood that knowledge transmission involves not just information, but the social and emotional contexts in which learning occurs. Evidence suggests they developed techniques for encoding complex information into seemingly simple patterns. What appears to be decorative stonework often contains sophisticated data about agricultural cycles, medical knowledge, engineering, principles and philosophical concepts. Students would spend years learning to read these information-dense surfaces, developing the kind of deep literacy that transforms raw data into lived wisdom. The preservation methods they employed were designed to survive any catastrophe. Knowledge was distributed redundantly throughout the city, so that even if entire sections were destroyed, essential information would persist in other locations. Key concepts were encoded in multiple formats: visual, spatial, numerical, and symbolic, ensuring that future scholars with different cultural backgrounds might still recover the essential teachings. In the residential areas, you find that even private homes were designed as learning environments. Family dwellings incorporated teaching spaces where knowledge was passed from generation to generation through daily interaction with educational architecture. Children would grow up surrounded by information-rich environments that made learning as natural as breathing. The city's layout itself tells a story about the evolution of human understanding. Older sections represent earlier stages of knowledge development, while newer areas show increasingly sophisticated integration of multiple disciplines. Walking from the oldest to the newest quarters is like traversing the history of human intellectual development compressed into a single settlement. As you explore these knowledge-preserving ruins, you begin to understand that this was more than a library or university. It was an attempt to create a living relationship between human consciousness and accumulated wisdom, a place where the boundary between learning and living dissolved into something more profound than either could achieve alone. In places where architecture was designed to catch and amplify natural sounds, you experience settlements that were instruments as much as habitations, their empty spaces still resonating with the harmony their builders composed. You approach through valleys where every footstep seems to echo with intentional music. The stone beneath your feet rings with subtle tones, pathways paved with materials chosen for their acoustic properties. This is your first indication that you are entering a place where sound was not incidental to life, but fundamental to existence itself. The city rises before you like a vast musical instrument carved from living rock. Buildings curve and spiral, according to principles of acoustic engineering that transform wind into symphony. Doorways are sized and positioned to create specific tones when air moves through them. Windows are shaped to catch and focus natural sounds, birdsongs, rainfall, wind through leaves, amplifying and harmonizing them into environmental music that would have provided a constant, ever-changing soundtrack to daily life. Walk slowly through the main thoroughfare and listen carefully. Despite centuries of abandonment, the place still sings. Wind moving through calculated gaps in walls creates chord progressions that shift with weather patterns. Rain falling on specially designed surfaces produces rhythmic patterns that seem composed rather than random. Even your own breathing and heartbeat seem to synchronize with the subtle acoustic rhythms built into the architecture. The central plaza features the most remarkable structure, a performance amphitheater that functions as a giant resonating chamber. Its circular design and carefully calculated proportions create acoustic properties that would allow a whispered word from the center to be heard clearly at any point around the perimeter, while simultaneously harmonizing multiple sounds into coherent musical arrangements. Stand in the center and speak softly. Your voice returns transformed, enriched with overtones and harmonics that seem to emerge from the stones themselves. In the residential quarters, each dwelling was designed as a unique acoustic environment. Some homes emphasized percussive sounds, their walls and surfaces creating rhythmic patterns from daily activities. Others were tuned for melodic expression, with interior spaces that would transform conversation into song. Still others functioned as harmonic resonators, taking sounds from neighboring houses and blending them into community-wide musical compositions. The builders developed sophisticated understanding of how sound affects human consciousness and well-being. Different districts of the city were tuned to produce psychological effects through acoustic design. The healing quarter featured structures that created frequencies associated with physical restoration and emotional balance. The contemplative section used architectural acoustics to induce meditative states. Areas designed for celebration incorporated sound amplification and rhythmic enhancement that would naturally encourage dancing and communal joy. Evidence suggests they created what can only be called architectural instruments, buildings designed to be played like massive musical devices. Channels carved into walls could be filled with water to different levels, changing the pitch of wind passing through them. Adjustable stone panels could be repositioned to alter acoustic properties seasonally. Some structures incorporated hanging elements that would chime with specific frequencies when stirred by calculated air currents. The integration of natural and designed sound reveals profound understanding of environmental harmony. They positioned buildings to capture and enhance the music already present in the landscape, the song of specific streams, the call of particular birds, the tonal qualities of wind through different types of vegetation. Rather than imposing artificial sounds on natural settings, they created architecture that amplified and organized the existing acoustic environment. Musical notation appears throughout the city, but not in forms recognizable to modern eyes. Stone surfaces are carved with flowing patterns that represent both visual art and musical scores, readable by those trained in the acoustic traditions of the place. These inscriptions suggest they developed systems for composing with environmental sounds, creating musical pieces that incorporated wind, water, animal calls, and human activity into coherent artistic expressions. The social implications of living in such an environment become clear as you explore further. In a city where every action produces musical sound, daily life becomes a form of collaborative composition. Walking, working, cooking, conversation, all would contribute to an ongoing community symphony. Citizens would develop acute sensitivity to the acoustic effects of their choices, creating a culture where individual behavior naturally harmonized with collective well-being. Seasonal changes would transform the city's musical character as different. Weather patterns activated varying acoustic elements. Spring rains would awaken dormant sound channels. Summer winds would play the architecture like a vast organ. Autumn leaves would create percussive rhythms as they fell on specially designed surfaces. Winter storms would produce dramatic symphonic effects that residents would anticipate and celebrate. In quieter corners of the settlement, you find spaces designed for acoustic solitude, chambers where sound is absorbed rather than amplified, creating environments for inner listening and personal musical meditation. These acoustic refuges balance the communal music making with opportunities for individual sonic contemplation. The preservation of musical knowledge appears to have been built into the city's structure. Acoustic principles are demonstrated through the architecture itself, ensuring that essential understanding about sound, rhythm, harmony, and their effects on human consciousness would persist even if traditional teaching methods were interrupted. As you prepare to leave this resonant city, you realize that its greatest achievement was not the creation of beautiful sounds, but the establishment of living conditions where beauty and daily necessity became indistinguishable. Here, music was not entertainment separate from practical life, but the organizing principle that transformed mundane activities into artistic expression and community celebration. You explore vast sacred complexes that grew to encompass entire civilizations, where the line between religious devotion and daily life disappeared, creating societies organized entirely around worship and wonder. Before you stretches what initially appears to be a city of enormous scale, but as you walk deeper into its maze of courtyards, corridors, and chambers, you begin to understand that this entire settlement was conceived as a single, vast temple. Every street is a processional way, every building a chapel or shrine, every public space designed to facilitate some aspect of spiritual practice. This is not a city with temples, this is a temple that became a city. The entrance alone overwhelms with its scale and ambition. Massive stone gates, frame doorways large enough for entire communities to pass through simultaneously. The threshold is carved with symbols that seem to shift and flow as you cross them, marking your passage from ordinary space into sanctified territory. Once inside, you realize there is no outside here. The sacred complex extends as far as the eye can see, encompassing what must have been the entire life of its inhabitants. Walk through the outer courtyards where daily commerce would have taken place. But notice how every merchant stall is positioned according to sacred geometry, how every workshop is oriented toward ceremonial purposes. Bread was baked here not merely to feed bodies, but as offering to divine forces. Cloth was woven not just for clothing, but as prayer made manifest in textile. Metalwork, pottery, carpentry, all the practical crafts of civilization were conducted as forms of worship, transforming necessary labor into spiritual practice. The residential areas reveal how completely religious devotion permeated every aspect of existence. Homes are not separate family units, but interconnected cells in the larger organism of the temple complex. Private space flows seamlessly into communal areas designed for group ritual and ceremony. Children would have grown up knowing no distinction between sacred and secular life, between worship time and ordinary time, because every moment in this place was consecrated to spiritual purpose. As you move deeper into the complex, the architecture becomes increasingly magnificent and mysterious. Halls stretch for hundreds of yards, their walls covered with carvings that tell stories spanning generations. These are not merely decorative but functional elements of religious practice. Visual prayers that participants would read as they walked, stories that guided meditation and contemplation, images that instructed believers in proper spiritual conduct. The central sanctuary defies description in ordinary terms. It is less a building than a landscape of devotion, with chambers that soar beyond sight and passageways that seem to extend into infinity. The acoustic properties create an environment where whispered prayers become thunderous invocations, where individual voices merge into choruses that seem to arise from the stones themselves. Standing here, you understand that this space was designed to dissolve the boundaries between human consciousness and divine presence. Multiple levels and terraces reveal the sophisticated organization of religious life that once flourished here. Different elevations were designated for different types of spiritual practice. Ground-level areas served daily devotions and community gatherings. Elevated platforms hosted seasonal celebrations and astronomical observations. The highest terraces were reserved for the most advanced spiritual practices, accessed only by those who had progressed through multiple stages of religious development. The integration of natural elements into the temple design shows profound understanding of spiritual ecology. Water channels carry sacred streams through every part of the complex, their flow creating rhythms that would regulate prayer cycles and meditation practices. Gardens planted with specific combinations of plants would bloom in sequences timed to religious festivals, creating natural calendars that connected spiritual observance with seasonal cycles. Evidence suggests the inhabitants developed forms of worship that engaged every human sense simultaneously. The visual splendor of carved surfaces and painted chambers would inspire awe. Acoustic design created soundscapes that induced altered states of consciousness. Incense burners built into the architecture would distribute fragrances that enhanced spiritual perception. Textured surfaces invited tactile interaction with sacred symbols. Even taste was incorporated through ritual foods prepared according to spiritual principles. The organization of space reveals a society structured entirely around spiritual hierarchy and religious function. Different areas were designated for different levels of initiation and understanding. Novices would inhabit outer sections while progressing gradually toward the central mysteries. The most sacred spaces were accessible only to those who had devoted lifetimes to spiritual development, creating a physical map of the soul's journey toward enlightenment. Libraries and scriptoriums integrated throughout the complex show how religious knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Sacred texts were copied and studied not in separate scholarly institutions but as integral parts of worship practice. Learning was inseparable from devotion, scholarship indistinguishable from prayer, intellectual development guided always by spiritual goals. The workshop areas reveal how artistic creation was conceived as divine collaboration. Sculptors, painters, architects, and craftsmen worked not as independent artists, but as participants in collective religious expression. Individual creativity served the greater purpose of creating environments that would facilitate spiritual transformation for entire communities. As you explore the living quarters of religious leaders, you find spaces designed for extreme spiritual discipline, meditation cells carved directly from rock, chambers for extended fasting and prayer, spaces for solitary contemplation that could accommodate years of uninterrupted spiritual practice. These are not comfortable accommodations, but tools for consciousness transformation. The abandonment of this vast temple city raises profound questions about the fate of societies organized entirely around spiritual purposes. Perhaps the inhabitants achieved their ultimate goal, transcendence so complete that physical existence became unnecessary. Or perhaps the demands of such intensive religious life proved unsustainable for human communities rooted in earthly needs. On high mesas and ancient mountaintops, you find structures clearly designed as launching points for journeys that were more spiritual than physical, where entire populations may have attempted to transcend earthly existence. You climb toward structures that crown the highest accessible peaks, pathways carved into cliff faces that seem designed to test determination and spiritual readiness. The ascent itself becomes a form of purification, each step requiring commitment to continue upward despite the increasingly difficult terrain. By the time you reach the elevated platforms, you understand that this journey was never merely geographical but always fundamentally transformational. The summit reveals artificial terraces and platforms that extend the natural mountaintop into something approaching a launching pad for consciousness itself. Massive stone circles mark spaces clearly designed for group gatherings, their positioning calculated to frame specific celestial events and astronomical alignments. This is not casual stargazing, but precise spiritual technology designed to facilitate types of experience that transcend ordinary human perception. The platforms themselves are masterworks of sacred engineering. Circular spaces paved with stones arranged in complex patterns that seem to pulse with their own energy. Standing in their centers produces sensations of weightlessness, of consciousness expanding beyond normal boundaries. The geometric designs carved into their surfaces create optical effects that induce altered states of awareness, visual pathways that guide attention beyond earthly concerns toward cosmic perspective. Around the central platforms, you find evidence of extensive preparation, areas where communities would ready themselves for whatever transformational events occurred here. Purification chambers carved into the living rock provided spaces for ritual cleansing. Meditation cells allowed for extended periods of mental preparation. Storage areas contained supplies for prolonged spiritual retreats that might last for seasons. The orientation of these structures reveals sophisticated understanding of astronomical and energetic phenomena. The platforms are positioned to capture specific types of cosmic radiation during particular celestial events. Solstices, equinoxes, planetary alignments, and stellar conjunctions would all have created optimal conditions for whatever practices were conducted here. This was spiritual technology calibrated to universal rhythms. Evidence suggests these were not individual spiritual retreats, but community endeavors involving entire populations. The scale of the platforms and supporting infrastructure indicates hundreds or possibly thousands of participants in synchronized group practices. Residential terraces carved into the mountainsides could accommodate large numbers of people for extended periods. Communal areas provided spaces for group preparation, shared meals, and collective ceremonies. The most striking features are what can only be called launching platforms, raised circular areas with no apparent practical function except to serve as focal points for experiences involving departure from normal consciousness. Some show evidence of fires that burned continuously for extended periods. Others feature channels and basins that might have held reflecting pools or ritual substances. All are positioned to maximize exposure to sky and stars. Stone markers around. The platforms appear to function as navigation aids, but not for earthly travel. These carefully positioned monoliths align with specific stars and planetary positions, creating reference points for consciousness journeys into cosmic realms. They suggest the inhabitants developed detailed maps of spiritual territories accessed through transcendent experience rather than physical movement. The technology they developed was elegant in its simplicity, yet profound in its implications. Sound chambers carved into the mountainside would amplify chanted prayers and send them echoing across vast distances. Mirrors and polished surfaces directed starlight and moonlight to create illumination effects during ceremonial activities. Wind channels focused air currents to create acoustic phenomena that would enhance altered states of consciousness. Examining the living areas reveals communities organized entirely around preparation for transcendent experiences. Daily life was structured to support spiritual development through diet, exercise, meditation, and study designed to prepare participants for consciousness-altering events. These were not casual spiritual practices, but intensive training programs for systematic exploration of non-ordinary reality. The abandonment of these platforms raises questions about the ultimate success or failure of the Transcendence projects. They facilitated, perhaps entire communities achieved their goal of consciousness liberation and no longer needed physical forms or earthly habitation. Perhaps the practices proved unsuccessful and populations dispersed to seek spiritual development through more conventional means. Some platforms show evidence of sudden abandonment, with personal belongings and ceremonial objects left in place, as if their owners simply vanished during spiritual practices. Others appear to have been deliberately closed down, with careful burial of sacred objects and formal sealing of ceremonial spaces. The variety of abandonment patterns suggests different outcomes for different communities attempting similar transcendence. Projects. The view from these elevated platforms encompasses vast territories of earth and sky, creating natural environments for consciousness expansion. Standing here, especially during optimal astronomical conditions, produces spontaneous alterations in perception and awareness. The platforms seem designed to amplify these natural effects, creating launching points for consciousness to explore realms beyond ordinary human experience. As you prepare to descend from these heights, you carry with you questions about the limits and possibilities of human spiritual development. These platforms represent attempts to systematically transcend the boundaries of earthly existence through collective spiritual practice. Whether they succeeded or failed, They stand as monuments to human aspiration toward cosmic consciousness and spiritual liberation. You walk through settlements where reality and dream were traded as currency, where the architecture itself seems to shift between sleeping and waking, solid and ethereal, memory and imagination. The boundaries blur as you approach this place, where day and night consciousness intermingled in ways that challenge your understanding of what constitutes reality. Buildings seem to shimmer at the edges of vision, their forms solid when observed directly, but fluid when glimpsed peripherally. Streets curve in patterns that make perfect sense while you walk them, but prove impossible to map accurately from memory. This is architecture designed to accommodate minds that moved freely between waking and dreaming states. The entrance to this city exists in multiple versions simultaneously. The gateway you see depends partly on your state of consciousness when approaching. Some visitors report elaborate archways carved with intricate dream imagery. Others describe simple openings that reveal their complexity only to those who enter with properly prepared awareness. The threshold itself seems to test readiness to participate in the fluid reality that exists beyond it. Walking through the main districts, you notice how buildings serve different functions at different times based on the consciousness states of their occupants. Structures that appear to be workshops during daylight hours transform into temples for dream practice during sleep periods. Market squares where practical goods were traded in waking hours became exchanges for dream experiences, memory fragments, and consciousness states during the community's sleep cycles. The residential architecture accommodates inhabitants who spent equal time in sleeping and waking states, treating both as equally valid aspects of existence. Bedchambers are positioned and designed to optimize dream experience through orientation to celestial movements, acoustic properties that enhance sleep consciousness, and comfort arrangements that support extended periods in altered states. Living spaces flow seamlessly between practical daily use and environments optimized for dream work and visionary experience. The central marketplace reveals the sophisticated economy that developed around consciousness trading. Permanent stalls display artifacts that seem to shift between physical objects and crystallized dream experiences. These dream merchants dealt in visions, memories, inspiration, prophetic insights, and emotional states that could be transferred between individuals through techniques lost to conventional understanding. Currency consisted not of gold or goods, but of rare dreams, powerful visions, and consciousness experiences that could be shared and traded. Evidence suggests they developed technologies for storing and transferring consciousness experiences between individuals. Crystal formations throughout the city appear to function as recording devices for dreams and visions. Specially prepared chambers allowed trained practitioners to enter others' dream states and extract specific experiences for preservation and trade. Consciousness itself became a commodity that could be refined, purified, and exchanged like any valuable material. The professional classes included dream architects who designed sleep experiences for clients, consciousness merchants who traded in rare mental states, and reality brokers who facilitated exchanges between waking and sleeping consciousness. Specialized buildings housed the equipment and environments necessary for these consciousness professions, creating economic systems based on mental and spiritual rather than purely material production. Religious practices in this city centered around the recognition that dream and waking consciousness were equally sacred aspects of divine experience. Temples were designed to facilitate worship that occurred simultaneously in multiple states of awareness. Ceremonies might begin in waking consciousness and continue in coordinated group dream experiences, creating religious observances that transcended the limitations of single consciousness states. The educational systems prepared citizens to function effectively in multiple reality states simultaneously. Children learned not only practical skills for physical existence, but also techniques for lucid dreaming, consciousness travel, and awareness that remained coherent across different states of being. Schools included facilities for teaching in dream states as well as waking instruction, creating educational experiences that utilize the full spectrum of human consciousness. The architecture incorporates materials and construction techniques that seem to respond to consciousness states. Walls that appear solid to casual observation become transparent to trained perception. Passages that exist clearly in dream consciousness have physical counterparts that can be accessed only by those maintaining proper awareness states. The buildings themselves seem to exist partially in physical reality and partially in consciousness realms accessible through dreaming. The government and social organization developed around principles that recognize dream consciousness as equally valid for decision-making and social coordination. Community meetings occurred in shared dream states where participants could communicate through direct consciousness transfer rather than spoken language. Laws and social agreements were negotiated in dream realms, where the consequences of decisions could be directly experienced before implementation in waking reality. The artistic achievements of this civilization reflect creative work that drew inspiration from both waking and dreaming consciousness. Sculptures change appearance based on the viewer's state of awareness. Paintings contain layers of imagery that become visible only to consciousness trained in dream perception. Music was composed to be heard simultaneously in waking and sleeping states, creating complex harmonies that span multiple levels of awareness. Medical practices treated ailments that affected both physical and dream bodies. Healing occurred through techniques that worked in consciousness realms as well as physical interventions. Diseases of dream consciousness were recognized and treated with the same seriousness as physical ailments. Health was understood to require balance and integration between all states of consciousness rather than merely physical well-being. The eventual abandonment of this city may relate to the ultimate success of its consciousness experiments. Perhaps the inhabitants achieved such complete integration of waking and dreaming awareness that physical settlements became unnecessary. Or perhaps the blurring of reality boundaries proved unsustainable for maintaining the practical necessities of earthly existence. In locations where past, present, and future converge like rivers meeting the sea, you discover cities that exist in multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously, their ruins showing what was, is, and might yet be. You enter territories where temporal boundaries dissolve into something more fluid than conventional time allows. The pathways ahead seem to exist in multiple moments simultaneously, showing wear patterns from past use, present decay, and future restoration all occurring within the same visual space. This is your first indication that you are approaching places where civilizations experimented with time itself as a building material and organizing principle. The city spreads before you in layers of temporal existence that challenge linear understanding. Buildings appear in various stages of construction and decay simultaneously. A structure might show ancient weathering on one side while displaying fresh construction on another, with sections that seem to flicker between past grandeur and future ruin. Walking through these temporal gardens feels like moving through a four-dimensional landscape where time unfolds spatially rather than sequentially. The central plaza exists as a temporal focal point where multiple chronologies converge. Standing here, you experience fragments of past events overlapping with present moment awareness and glimpses of potential futures. The stone beneath your feet bears the impressions of countless gatherings separated by centuries, yet all, somehow, occurring now. Shadows fall from structures that exist in different temporal periods, creating patterns of light and darkness that shift according to which timeline dominates your perception. Residential areas show homes occupied across multiple time periods simultaneously. Through properly trained perception, you can observe daily life from various eras occurring in the same spaces. Families from different centuries share the same dwellings, their activities overlapping in ways that create temporal communities spanning generations. Children from past ages play alongside those from potential futures, their games creating continuities that transcend chronological limitations. The architecture itself appears designed to accommodate temporal multiplicity. Doorways open onto the same rooms in different time periods. Corridors connect spaces from various eras, allowing movement between past and future through spatial rather than temporal navigation. Windows frame views that change depending on which temporal layer dominates the observer's awareness, showing the same landscapes across different historical moments. The builders developed construction techniques that utilize time as a primary material. They learned to anchor structures in multiple temporal periods simultaneously, creating buildings that existed across centuries rather than within single chronological moments. These temporal foundations required understanding of how consciousness relates to time perception and how physical structures can be designed to interact with various temporal states. Evidence suggests they achieved practical applications of temporal manipulation for daily life improvement. Agricultural areas show crops harvesting themselves according to temporal loops that compressed growing seasons into continuous productivity. Water systems drew from rainfall patterns across multiple time periods, ensuring consistent supply regardless of seasonal variations in any single chronological timeline. The governance systems operated through temporal democracy, where decisions were made through consultation with past wisdom and future consequences simultaneously. Council chambers were designed to facilitate meetings that included representatives from multiple time periods, creating legislative processes that considered the impacts of decisions across extended temporal ranges rather than immediate political concerns. Educational facilities provided instruction that spanned multiple temporal perspectives. Students learned history through direct observation of past events and studied potential futures through consciousness techniques that accessed probable timelines. Knowledge was transmitted not just through conventional teaching, but through temporal immersion that allowed learners to experience information across various chronological contexts. The economic systems developed currencies based on temporal rather than material value. Labor could be performed in past time periods to create present wealth. Resources could be borrowed from future abundance to address present needs. Trade occurred across temporal boundaries, with goods and services exchanged between different eras according to principles that optimize benefit across extended time periods. Religious practices centered around worship that acknowledged the simultaneous existence of past, present, and future states of divine manifestation. Temples were designed as temporal portals where congregants could experience sacred presence across multiple chronological dimensions. Ceremonies occurred in temporal loops that connected participants with religious celebrations from past and future, creating worship experiences that transcended chronological limitations. The artistic achievements reflect creative work that incorporated temporal multiplicity as fundamental aesthetic principle. Sculptures show subjects aging and transforming across centuries within single artistic pieces. Paintings depict scenes that change based on temporal perspective, showing the same subjects across different life stages and historical periods simultaneously. Music was composed to be heard across multiple time periods, creating harmonies that spanned generation. The medical understanding recognized that health required balance across temporal as well as physical dimensions. Healing practices addressed ailments that affected past and future versions of patients as well as present conditions. Treatments worked through temporal intervention that could address root causes occurring in past experiences and prevent future health problems through adjustments made in present time. The abandonment patterns suggest various outcomes for these temporal experiments. Some areas appear frozen in temporal loops, endlessly repeating cycles of activity from peak periods of civilization. Others show evidence of temporal acceleration that compressed entire historical periods into brief moments, possibly overwhelming inhabitants with the speed of temporal change. Standing in these time gardens, as your exploration concludes, you understand that these ruins represent humanity's most ambitious attempt to transcend the limitations of linear time. Whether successful or ultimately unsustainable, they demonstrate the possibility that consciousness might exist in more complex relationships with time than conventional experience suggests, opening questions about the true nature of temporal reality itself. At the edge of known geography, you find the final city of an ancient civilization whose sole purpose was observation and record-keeping, guardians who documented the rise and fall of all other lost places. You reach the boundaries of the world, as ancient maps understood it, where familiar territories give way to the unknown and the unknowable. Here, perched on precipices that overlook vast emptiness, stands the most remote settlement you have encountered. This outpost was built not for commerce, conquest, or community, but for watching. The watchers who lived here dedicated their existence to observing, recording, and preserving the memory of all other civilizations, including those you have walked through in your journey. The city's position reveals its purpose immediately. Every building, every tower, every observation platform is oriented toward distant horizons where other settlements once flourished. Massive stone telescopes, their lenses long since shattered but their frames intact, still point toward the location of cities now buried beneath sand, sea, and time. This was not a place for living ordinary lives, but for maintaining eternal vigil over the rise and fall of human civilization. The architecture speaks of patient, methodical minds devoted to long-term observation. Structures built to last millennia stretch in all directions, their foundations anchored deep into bedrock to withstand any catastrophe that might threaten their record-keeping mission. Observatory towers reach impossible heights, their stairs, worn smooth by countless generations of watchers climbing daily to their surveillance posts. These were people who understood that their work would span not years or decades, but centuries of careful documentation. The Central Archive dominates the settlement like a mountain made of organized knowledge. This massive structure housed the accumulated observations of the watchers across their entire existence as a civilization. Room after room contains stone tablets, carved walls, and inscribed surfaces that record the daily life, achievements, struggles, and eventual fate of every other lost city you have encountered. Here are detailed maps of the Constellation Cities, precise measurements of the musical architecture, careful drawings of the dream merchants' impossible buildings. Walking through these archive chambers, you realize you are seeing the other lost cities through the eyes of their contemporaries. The Watchers maintained communication networks across vast distances, receiving regular reports from observers embedded in societies throughout the known world. They documented not just what these civilizations built, but how they lived, what they believed, why they made the choices that ultimately led to their abandonment or disappearance. The record-keeping systems they developed surpass anything attempted by other civilizations. Information was stored in multiple formats to ensure survival across any conceivable disaster. Stone carvings provided permanent records immune to fire or flood. Metal tablets offered durability against weathering. Crystal matrices held detailed information accessible only to those trained in their reading techniques. Every significant observation was recorded in at least 3 different media using multiple languages and symbol systems. The Watchers themselves lived lives of deliberate simplicity, dedicating all resources and attention to their observation mission. Personal quarters were sparse, functional spaces designed for rest between observation duties rather than comfortable living. Communal areas focused on facilities for analyzing and discussing observations rather than entertainment or leisure. Food production, craft work, and maintenance activities were all organized to support the primary mission of watching and recording. Their observation methods reveal sophisticated understanding of information gathering and analysis. They developed techniques for long-distance viewing that combined optical instruments with trained perception abilities. Weather prediction systems allowed them to anticipate optimal conditions for observation. Communication networks using smoke signals, reflected light, and other methods kept them in contact with observers stationed at remote monitoring points. The training systems for new watchers were comprehensive and demanding. Students spent decades learning to observe accurately, record faithfully, and analyze patterns across multiple civilizations simultaneously. They studied the history of all known settlements, learned techniques for detecting early signs of cultural change, and developed the emotional discipline necessary to witness the decline and fall of entire peoples without intervening. The ethical framework that guided their work reveals profound philosophical sophistication. The Watchers believed their role was to observe and record rather than influence or interfere. They documented wars, natural disasters, social collapses, and cultural achievements with equal attention to accuracy and completeness. Their purpose was preservation of knowledge rather than prevention of tragedy, understanding that intervention would compromise the objectivity necessary for truthful record-keeping. Evidence suggests they maintained their vigil across centuries, possibly millennia, watching the rise and fall of multiple waves of civilization. Their records document not just the final lost cities, but earlier settlements that preceded them, creating continuous historical narratives spanning far longer periods than any other civilization attempted to preserve. They were the memory keepers of humanity's entire experimental journey through different forms of social organization. The communication systems they established connected them with every other civilization of their era. Messenger networks, signal stations, and embedded observers provided constant information flow from all inhabited regions. They knew about the Constellation Cities' astronomical discoveries, the Dream Merchant's consciousness experiments, the Time Gardener's temporal investigations, often while these civilizations were still at their peak, rather than only after their decline. The analysis chambers reveal their attempts to understand patterns in civilizational development. They studied cycles of growth and decay, identified common factors in cultural collapse, and developed theoretical models for predicting the longevity of different social experiments. Their work represents humanity's first systematic attempt at comparative civilization studies conducted across multiple contemporary societies. The abandonment of this outpost marks the end of their watching mission. Evidence suggests the final Watchers completed their comprehensive record of all other lost civilizations and then deliberately closed their own settlement. They sealed the archives, dismantled the communication networks, and departed for unknown destinations. Perhaps they achieved their ultimate goal and no longer needed to maintain their vigil. Perhaps they too succumbed to the same forces that claimed all the civilizations they had observed. The last inscriptions found here suggest they recognized their own impending end and made preparations for future discoverers. They created summary records, organized their archives for accessibility by later investigators, and left guidance for interpreting their observational methods. Their final act was to document their own civilization with the same thoroughness they had applied to all others. Standing among these final records, you understand that the Watchers represent humanity's attempt to transcend the limitations of individual civilizational perspective through systematic observation and comparison. They sought to preserve not just information but understanding about the full range of human social and cultural experimentation. Their outpost stands as testimony, to the possibility of learning from the entirety of human experience rather than being limited to single cultural viewpoints. You arrive at a place that exists only when remembered, a city built from the collective longing of all lost civilizations, where every vanished street and forgotten temple finds its way home. Here, you understand that nothing is truly lost, only transformed. This final destination on your journey through lost cities cannot be approached through ordinary travel. You arrive here not by walking, but by remembering, not through physical movement, but through the accumulated weight of all the places you have witnessed. The City of Returns exists in the space between memory and possibility, constructed from the collective yearning of all vanished civilizations to continue existing despite their physical disappearance. The entrance materializes as you recognize it, built from architectural elements borrowed from every lost city you have encountered. Pillars from the Constellation Cities support arches reminiscent of the Drowned Cathedrals. Doorways shaped like those in the Crystal Sanctuaries open onto pathways paved with stones from the mountain cities. This is not imitation, but resurrection. The authentic spiritual essence of lost places reconstituted in new combinations. Walking through the main thoroughfares, you encounter inhabitants who seem familiar yet impossible. These are not ghosts, but continuation, the essential qualities of vanished peoples finding expression through new forms. The dream merchants continue their consciousness trade here, but now they deal in memories of places that no longer exist. Physically, the Watchers maintain their observation posts, but now they monitor the interaction between lost and found, vanished and remembered. The architecture shifts continuously as different civilizations assert their presence within the shared space. A building might begin as the stark, functional design of the underground kingdoms, but transform as you watch into the flowing, organic forms of the garden cities. Streets curve according to the musical principles of the sound cities, while incorporating the astronomical alignments favored by the constellation builders. Nothing remains fixed because everything must accommodate the continuing creative impulses of all the lost civilizations. The residential areas house not families, but affinities, groups of qualities and characteristics from various lost civilizations that have found compatibility in this space of eternal return. Technological innovations from the Crystal Sanctuaries coexist with spiritual practices from the Ascension Platforms. Agricultural techniques from the garden cities support populations that include consciousness explorers from the dream merchant, settlements and time travelers from the temporal gardens. The Central Plaza serves as a meeting ground where representatives from all lost civilizations gather to share their continued development. Here, you witness conversations between architectural philosophers from the stone libraries and musical theorists from the instrument cities. Religious leaders from the temple civilizations collaborate with astronomical observers from the constellation settlements. The exchange of ideas continues here in ways that were impossible when these civilizations existed in separate physical locations. The economic systems operating here transcend material exchange entirely. Currency consists of preserved knowledge, maintained traditions, and continued innovation based on the foundational insights of vanished civilizations. Trade occurs in possibilities, what might have developed if particular civilizations had continued their experimentation without interruption. Markets deal in potential futures derived from past achievements. The governing structures reflect the political innovations of all lost civilizations synthesized into new forms of organization. Decision-making processes combine the temporal democracy of the time gardens with the cosmic perspective of the constellation cities and the consciousness-based participation methods of the dream merchants. Laws are derived from the ethical insights developed across multiple vanished societies rather than imposed by single cultural traditions. Educational institutions here provide instruction unavailable in any single lost civilization. Students can learn astronomical observation techniques from the Constellation Cities while simultaneously studying consciousness manipulation methods from the dream merchants and temporal navigation skills from the time gardeners. Knowledge that was fragmentary in individual civilizations becomes comprehensive through integration across multiple cultural perspectives. The artistic achievements represent collaborations between creative traditions that could never interact in physical reality. Musicians from the sound cities compose symphonies that incorporate the acoustic properties of drowned cathedrals and the harmonic principles discovered in Crystal Sanctuaries. Architects design buildings that combine the temporal multiplicity techniques of the time gardens with the consciousness-responsive materials developed by the dream merchants. Religious and spiritual practices synthesize insights from all the lost civilizations into comprehensive approaches to consciousness development and cosmic understanding. Temples here accommodate simultaneously the astronomical worship of constellation cities, the acoustic devotion of music cities, the consciousness exploration of dream settlements, and the temporal transcendence sought by Ascension Platform communities. The therapeutic and healing systems available integrate medical knowledge from multiple lost civilizations. Physical ailments can be treated using crystal healing techniques while simultaneously addressing consciousness imbalances through dream work and temporal interventions. Health is understood in the comprehensive terms developed across all vanished societies rather than limited to single cultural perspectives on wellness. The research and development activities focus on completing projects that were interrupted by the abandonment of individual civilizations. Scientists here continue the crystal technology investigations, advance the consciousness trading methods, develop the temporal manipulation techniques, and pursue the astronomical discoveries that were left unfinished when their originating civilizations disappeared. The preservation systems ensure that nothing from any lost civilization is ever truly forgotten. Every technique, insight, tradition, and innovation finds continuation through new applications and developments. The City of Returns functions as the eternal repository and continuation of human civilizational experimentation, where abandonment becomes transformation rather than termination. Community celebrations honor the achievements of all lost civilizations. While recognizing their continuation in new forms, festivals incorporate elements from every vanished culture, creating observances that span the full range of human creative and spiritual expression. These gatherings demonstrate that the end of individual civilizations does not mean the end of their contributions to human development. As you explore this impossible city built from memory and longing, you begin to understand that your entire journey through lost places has been preparation for this recognition. Nothing is ever truly lost because every authentic achievement of human consciousness and creativity finds its way into the continuing story of human development. Physical abandonment is just one form of transformation. The boundaries between visitor and resident blur here because everyone who truly encounters lost civilizations becomes part of their continuation. Your journey through buried cities, drowned temples and forgotten gardens has made you a carrier of their essential qualities. You are no longer just observing lost places, but participating in their eternal return. Standing in the central plaza of this city that exists through collective memory and individual recognition, you realize that the lost cities you have visited were never truly lost. They were waiting, patient as the stones from which they were built, for consciousness capable of recognizing their continued existence in new forms. Your journey ends where it began, with the understanding that human Creativity and spiritual achievement transcends any physical limitation. The footsteps you have taken tonight through these buried cities, these drowned temples, these forgotten gardens, have been real. Not in the way archaeologists measure reality, but in the way dreamers and poets know truth. Perhaps these mysteries are not lost. Perhaps they are simply waiting, patient as stone, fluid as water, eternal as the human heart that seeks wonder in the darkness. You have walked through ruins that teach patience, through settlements that demonstrate possibility, through civilizations that show the magnificent scope of human imagination when directed toward transcendent goals. Each lost city you encountered was not just a record of past achievement, but a template for future becoming. The Constellation Cities show that human consciousness can align with cosmic rhythms. The dream merchants prove that reality is more fluid than ordinary experience suggests. The time gardens demonstrate that consciousness might transcend linear, temporal limitations. In the Crystal Sanctuaries, you learned that matter and spirit are not separate, but different expressions of unified creative force. The underground kingdoms taught that depth and darkness can nurture wisdom rather than fear. The musical cities showed that daily life can be transformed into artistic expression through conscious attention to harmony and rhythm. Each place you visited expanded your understanding of what human communities might achieve when organized, around principles that honor both practical necessity and transcendent aspiration. The Watchers, in their remote outpost, preserved all this knowledge because they understood that human consciousness requires the full spectrum of civilizational experimentation to continue its development. No single approach to community organization, spiritual practice, or technological development contains all possibilities. The complete picture emerges only through recognition of the entire range of human creative and spiritual achievement. In the City of Returns, you discovered that nothing authentically achieved by human consciousness is ever truly lost. Physical abandonment, cultural disappearance, and historical forgetting are just forms of transformation that prepare achievements for integration into continuing human development. The lost cities wait for rediscovery, not as museum pieces, but as living possibilities for future becoming. Your journey through these places changes you because authentic encounter with transcendent human achievement expands consciousness beyond previous limitations. You carry within you now the accumulated wisdom of all lost civilizations, their discoveries about time and consciousness, matter and spirit, individual development and community organization. This knowledge becomes part of your continuing contribution to human civilizational development. Sleep now, knowing that somewhere in the space between memory and possibility, these cities continue their quiet existence, and your dreams tonight may walk their empty streets and hear their whispered secrets. The silence is not empty. It is full of everything we have forgotten how to hear, waiting for consciousness capable of receiving the accumulated wisdom of human, spiritual, and creative achievement. Perhaps tomorrow you will begin to build something new, informed by what you have learned in places that exist beyond ordinary maps. Perhaps the lost cities you have visited will find expression through your choices, your creativity, your approach to community and consciousness. Perhaps their apparent loss was actually preparation for their integration into forms of human development not yet imagined. The ancient builders understood that their greatest achievements might require centuries to be fully appreciated and implemented. They built for consciousness not yet developed, planted seeds for harvest by future awareness, created templates for human becoming that transcend any single historical period. Their gifts to you are not artifacts but possibilities, ways of understanding and organizing human life that honor both earthly necessity and cosmic aspiration. Rest in the knowledge that human consciousness contains all possibilities, that every lost city exists as potential within your own awareness, that the journey through forgotten places was always a journey through the unexplored territories of your own being. The cities were never truly lost. They were waiting for you to develop the consciousness necessary to find them. And in finding them, you have become part of their eternal return to the continuing story of human becoming.